Humanity lost. By the time he became strong enough to save the world, almost all of mankind was already dead. With no other choice, humanity's ultimate weapon fell into a deep sleep, placing all hope in a future he would one day see. 100 million years later, he opens his eyes to a world that has been reborn from the ashes. But the strongest warrior from the old world soon realizes one terrifying truth: some monsters never truly disappear. The story begins in the year 2100. The protagonist, clutching tightly to the side of a fighter jet flying high in the sky, looked down and uttered a short statement. He'd found the spot. The next moment, he abruptly leaped down, cutting through the air with a rapid fall. Meanwhile, on the ground, a young man was desperately running along a crumbling road, stones and concrete crumbling under his feet. He screamed hysterically, "Anyone? Is anyone here?" Tears streamed down his dirty face, mixing with the dust. The next second, a huge monster landed right in front of him with a deafening roar, a distorted, twisted face, seemingly melted. The young man froze in horror, as more and more creatures began to emerge from the rubble around him. He fell to his knees and, choking with fear, began to beg for salvation. Anyone. He clutched the photograph of his family convulsively in his trembling hand and cried out through tears. Idiots turned the world into this. He must avenge them. And at that very moment, the protagonist dropped to the ground with a sharp jerk. He didn't waste time on words. With one powerful blow of his fist, he smashed the head of the distorted one, and it flew to the side. The protagonist quietly said, "Sorry for the delay." The guy, still trembling all over, looked up at him with tear-filled eyes and exhaled hoarsely, "Who is he?" Then, as if his strength suddenly returned, he stretched out his hand and shouted, "Ah, yes, finally!" His voice broke into a sob. "Finally, people will be able to take everything back, right?" He rushed forward and grabbed the protagonist's clothes, as if afraid he would disappear. Aga calmly nodded. "Now you can calm down." Only now did it become clear that a huge, jagged wound gaped in the boy's back. Through clenched teeth, he whispered, "Thank you," and exhausted, collapsed to the ground. The protagonist closed his eyes for a moment, silently looking at the lifeless body, and then felt Kagura approach him. Kagura quietly said, "Sito, they didn't make it in time after all." He adjusted his glasses, and Sito finally looked at him. Kagura added, "It looks like he's the last survivor in the area. It's time to give up, Sito. You just have to accept it. Humanity has come to an end." He paused for a second and then continued. Due to constant environmental pollution, mutations gave birth to the warped ones, monsters with incredible regenerative abilities. Even nuclear weapons couldn't stop them. People continued to fight, experimenting on themselves, looking for a way to counter this threat. But in the end, they were too late. There was no one to save. Sito slowly shook his head and quietly said, "They still have something to save." He took a step forward without looking back. Kagura watched him go and asked, "Does he really think there are any survivors left?" Sito stopped but didn't turn around. He calmly answered, "No, he's talking about the future." He turned his head slightly and added, "About the nanomachines they invented. They can not only destroy the regenerative abilities of the corrupted, but also restore the planet's environment. So one day, Earth will return to its former beauty. And when that happens, a thriving civilization will once again emerge here, like humanity." Kagura chuckled humorlessly. It sounded like a pipe dream. Sito moved forward again, putting his hands in his pockets and quietly said, "So be it. Even the slightest possibility is enough. His strength may be needed again in the future, and perhaps it is this faith that will save future generations. He only needs to preserve this possibility." Kagura nodded silently, walked over to the special capsule, and carefully placed Sito inside. The system responded impassively. Cryosleep activation. Years passed. Mutations continued to evolve. Nature lived its life, and so 100 million years passed. Finally, the system spoke again. The access key confirmed. The defrosting from cryosleep begins. At that moment, Hakamafil ran forward, breathing heavily, her hair flying over her shoulders. A huge, distorted one chased after her, its claws scraping the floor. Danpo, barely keeping up with her, cried out, "Is he really here?" Without slowing down, she cried out, "Yes." Shandi, stumbling, barely kept up with them, and breathlessly muttered, "But if he's not here, then they'll all die." Hakama stopped abruptly near the massive door, clutched the key hanging around her neck to her chest, and looking ahead, cried out, "Guardian God, he must be here." They burst into the room, and Hakama threw the door open with all her might. Danpo froze in the threshold and cried out in confusion, "Hey, this is a dead end." Hakama looked around in horror, her gaze darting around the room until it fell on the cryosleep pod. At that very moment, the warped one burst into the room. Shandi, seeing it, screamed in panic. What should they do now? Hakama, pressed against the wall, closed her eyes and began to whisper, then screamed, "Please save them, Guardian God." And the next moment, the pod began to open. A calm voice came from within, "As they wish." A bright flash of energy rushed forward and pierced the monster's head, tearing it apart. The protagonist emerged from the capsule, his silhouette momentarily enveloped in a glow. He looked at the three frightened people and calmly said, "She sees. All you had to do was believe." He then extended his hand, condensed with pure energy, and added, "into a possible future." After that, the protagonist said, "As expected of a storage facility created by Kagura. His clothes are here, just as before." With that, he opened the drawer, then glanced at the many monitors, and thought, "But 100 million years have passed in the world. Wow, most of the data is corrupted. It's amazing this place hasn't fallen apart. Perhaps he should thank the nanomachines dispersed in the air." He then looked at the cube and mentally noted, "I'd like to know what the world has become." but all he had left was Kagura's message. After that, he turned to the planet's current inhabitants and said that he'd like to hear from them first. He stood naked, and Danpo abruptly closed Hakama's eyes. The protagonist said sheepishly, "Oh, he's sorry. He'd spent 100 million years without clothes." He was a little confused. Then he put his clothes on and remarked, "That's better. This is how he usually looks." After some time, they went outside, shielding themselves from the bright sun. The protagonist looked ahead and thought, so this is the world 100 million years later, completely different from before. The next second, Hakama took him by the sleeve and said, "Guardian God." She pointed to the side and added, "This way." He should have followed them, but the protagonist glanced at his companions and thought, "People? No, humanity died out 100 million years ago, so something else has evolved. These creatures are similar to people and yet different." Apparently, they were influenced by nanomachines. The fact that even after so many years they speak the same language serves as proof of this. Then the MC smiled and said, "By the way, he still hasn't introduced himself. He's Sito." Jin, she can just call him Sito. Hakama did the same. The others introduced themselves as well. Soon Hakama pulled the protagonist aside and he asked, "So what? What do they want from him?" She answered, "They are almost there. He must defeat the distorted ones." He asked again if he understood correctly what she meant. After some time, Shandi screamed loudly. He covered his face with his hand and shouted, "Village!" They stood on a hill overlooking the village engulfed in flames. Shandi, tears in his eyes, rushed forward shouting, "Dad, Mom." Hakama extended her hand to him and shouted, "Stop." The protagonist briefly noted, "A wooden fence, wooden buildings. It seems their civilization is not very advanced." After that, they entered the village and noticed the grandmother, who was trying to hold back a huge distorted one with a staff. The woman turned around and exclaimed, "Hakama, why did you come back?" The protagonist paused for a moment. "So this is the distorted one?" "Yes, that's exactly what it looks like. Apparently the name hasn't changed in this era." The grandmother shouted, "Hurry, get out of here." But Hakama, on the contrary, concentrated her energy in her body and firmly declared, "She won't run away. She will save her." The protagonist noted to himself, an interesting reaction. He needed to figure this out. He suddenly leaped to the side, was at the monster in the blink of an eye, and kicked it. Then he scooped the grandmother up in his arms, quietly apologized, and rushed away, carrying her to safety. Meanwhile, Hakama concentrated her energy in her palms, and the protagonist shouted, "Aha, come on!" A powerful ball of energy formed in her hand, after which she directed it straight at the monster. MC lowered the grandmother to the ground, and looking at the distorted one, thought, he knew it. This is the power of machines, breaking through regeneration. He feels that the distorted one is not being restored. She uses nanomachines suspended in the air, but only compatible people should have such power. After this, he turned to grandmother and asked, "This fireball of hers, can everyone do this in this era?" The grandmother thought in surprise, "In this era?" and then answered, "No, not everyone. In their village, only 4 people can use this sacred power, including her." The protagonist thoughtfully said, "Sacred powers," and mentally added, "So this is what they call the ability to control nanomachines." At that moment, Hakama ran up to them and exclaimed, "Grandma, what about the others?" She answered, "She evacuated them. But something more important is, why did they come back? The village is almost destroyed." With these words, she looked down in despair and added, "This distorted one is just a newborn cub. They can't cope with its main body, and after some time a horde of such newborns will burn down all the forests." The next second, Sauls approached the group and snapped, "Enough chatter, old woman." Grandmother jumped up. "Sauls." He was clutching a staff in his hand. Coming closer, he confidently declared, "These distorted ones are small fry. He can handle them himself." Grandmother looked at him and asked, "What about the rest of the villagers?" Sauls frowned, scratched the back of his head and replied, "Don't worry, they're already in the shelter." Then Hakama ran up to her father and greeted him joyfully. He smiled, looking at her, and said, "She's disappeared." He was so scared. "Where did she even disappear to?" Hakama answered, "They went to the sealed door." Grandmother cried out in alarm. "Hakama, she went to the forbidden place?" She quietly said, "After all, she herself once said a long time ago that behind this door is the god, the protector of the village, and when the village is in danger, he will definitely come to the rescue." After these words, the grandmother turned her gaze to the protagonist and thought, "This man too, he doesn't look like a god at all." At the same moment, Sauls chuckled. "Don't talk nonsense. She means to say that this inferior being is their guardian god? Don't be ridiculous." The protagonist quietly asked, "Inferior being?" Shandi looked at Sauls and exclaimed, "Pashat brother, he really is their guardian god." Sauls seemed to be calculating something in his mind and muttered, "What?" He knew he was with Hakama when he couldn't find him. Then Sauls stepped closer to the protagonist and shouted, pointing a finger at him, "Look at his ears. It's obvious. He has no animal abilities, no special strength. He's an inferior being. He just happened to be here." The kids were mistaken, right? Shandi furiously objected. "He's the one who's mistaken. The guardian god just defeated the corrupted one." Sauls continued to grin. "Yeah, a cub. He could have killed him with one kick." Then he stared at the protagonist and said coldly, "Look, they'll sort out their own problems." Frowning, he pointed his weapon at him and added, "They don't need some lowly stranger here, meddling in where it doesn't belong, so don't interfere." He turned around and walked away, but the old woman called out to him, "Stop! Where is he going?" Sauls just waved his hand. "Isn't it clear? He's going to beat up the huge distorted one, and they can sit here and shake with fear." Everyone involuntarily turned around. The grandmother exclaimed in pain, "Stupid boy. If he had just left, he could have survived." She turned to the protagonist and quietly said, She doesn't know who he is, but he saved them today. If he doesn't mind, he can go with her son and take the children to the shelter, and she will go for Saul's. Let this be our last chance. Hakama cried out in alarm. Grandmother! The protagonist turned sharply and firmly declared his refusal. He too had pride. He couldn't allow some upstart to call him a lesser being and then die. Meanwhile, the huge, distorted one froze in the water. Saul stepped into the water and called out to the monster. Hey! He concentrated energy in his weapon and loudly proclaimed, he is the one who will lead this nation and become a paladin. The likes of him, he will destroy with his own hands. With these words, he rushed straight towards the monster. The next second, several cubs rushed at him. Saul swung his weapon, cutting through the attackers, and roared, out of the way. He approached the largest of the distorted ones and shouted, he will finish it with one blow. Pushing off from the water, he delivered a powerful blow straight to the creature's face. Landing a little further away, Saul turned around in surprise and noticed that the wound on the monster's body had begun to heal. At that very moment, a huge clawed paw darted towards him. He instinctively covered it with his hand and then stared ahead in amazement. A barrier erected by the protagonist appeared in front of him. Saul looked at the protagonist and he asked, is he finished? The next moment, a baby monster jumped at him. Saul jumped aside and cried out, is he still alive? Then MC snapped his fingers and a powerful beam of energy pierced both monsters at once. Saul cried out in shock. It can't be. The rest of the villagers ran closer. Hakama shouted, Grandma, here, faster. Everyone suddenly froze, stunned by the spectacle. The grandmother thought, what's going on? Is he holding this enormous creature back with just one hand? She turned her gaze to the protagonist, who quietly said, it's getting heavy. Saul asked in confusion, what? The protagonist said curtly, we need to retreat. With a sharp jerk, he grabbed Saul and flew with him to the side, then carefully set him on the ground. Saul stared at him. Who was he? The protagonist calmly explained, these creatures regenerate immediately after receiving damage. To destroy them, you need to use nanomachines. This blocks recovery. Saul asked again, nanomachines? The protagonist replied, what they call sacred powers. The attack was excellent, but such wounds do not stop regeneration. Saul froze, processing what he heard. He asked, is he really their protector god? The protagonist shook his head slightly. He did not remember being appointed a god, but he wanted to tell him something else. It's their village's problem, right? He replied, yeah. He clenched his fist and began, that's why he. But before he could finish, the protagonist noticed he was mistaken. He turned his gaze to the monster and firmly said, it's his problem. At that very moment, several tentacles darted towards the protagonist. He deftly dodged, flowing from side to side, and mentally noted, first, he needed to lead them away from the village. Jumping back sharply, he said, these creatures are monsters born of their stupidity, and as someone who has lived for millions of years, it is his responsibility to put an end to this. With these words, he concentrated energy in his palms and directed it at the distorted one. Saul muttered in confusion. He has no idea what he's talking about, but can he really do it? He replied, I can. He is what created humanity, the embodiment of a long and bloody history, full of unimaginable tragedies. He is its last man. The next moment, a powerful beam of energy erupted from the glowing magical symbol before the protagonist, and the corrupted one was literally incinerated. The others froze with their mouths open, unable to believe what they saw. Hakama happily pressed her hands to her chest and clutched the key hanging around her neck. A stream of energy soared out of the atmosphere, rushing high into space. All that remained of the monster was a molten heap. Saul stared at the protagonist, dumbfounded. He looked down at his hands and quietly said, the last weapon of science. At that moment, a girl appeared from behind the bushes. She had come to investigate rumors that a new corrupted one had appeared near the village of Kodama, and now she saw something completely incredible. Adjusting her glasses, she wondered, what was that? Even the paladin captain in the capital couldn't do this. We must return to the capital immediately and report everything to the guildmaster. After some time, the protagonist stood in the forest, clutching the cube in his hands. At this point, Kagura's projection appeared. Kagura quietly asked, Sito, can he hear him? If he can see this, he's most likely no longer alive. He always wanted to say this. Well, what about the future? The environment is probably in much better shape than he could have hoped. But there's a problem. The protagonist frowned and said, problem? Kagura said, you'll get straight to the point. Even if nature has improved, the warped ones most likely haven't died out. But about 1,000 years after he was frozen, he began to feel like something was wrong. He went into cryosleep from time to time and observed the changes in the world. With the improvement of the environment, the number of warped ones did indeed decrease. That was how it was at first. But then everything changed. Along with the evolution of nature, the distorted ones began to change as well. He doesn't know what exactly has changed in them, but now they are a real threat. All he could do was make adjustments to future intelligent life so that humans would at least have a chance against the corrupted ones. And he also left a little power for him. The protagonist asked in surprise, power? He took a syringe out of his pocket and picked it up. Is this what he meant? Kagura said, if he uses this, the nanomachines themselves will tell him everything. MC gave the injection, and energy spread through his body. As Kagura said, only he could use this power. After all the experiments, his body became 100% compatible with nanomachines. The protagonist looked at his hands and muttered, so now he can create objects by changing the shape of nanomachines. Very convenient. At that moment, blades silently extended from his palms. The Kagura projection bowed his head slightly, folding his arms across his chest, and said, he hid similar amplifiers in various laboratories scattered around the world. He didn't keep everything in one place. If the Twisted Ones ever found it, they wouldn't be able to destroy it all in one blow. He also wanted him to go on a journey. He didn't know what the threat from the Twisted Ones would be in the distant future, but compared to the old world, the situation should still be better. So for now, just try to enjoy this new world, and he wouldn't see how it all turned out. At that moment, his features began to rapidly age, as if time, which wasn't in the recording, had suddenly overtaken him. The protagonist froze, unable to look away. Kagura quietly added, he's counting on him, Sito. He must save this world. The image faded. MC whispered, he understood. The next second, Hakama ran up to him and exclaimed, Guardian God, there he is. Danpo ran next to her, waving his arms. They were all looking for him. They grabbed his hands and Hakama pulled him forward. Let's go back quickly. Danpo added, they can't start without the main star. The protagonist noticed the key around Hakama's neck and thought, isn't this the key to that very door to the laboratory? He stopped and asked, Hakama, where did she get this medallion? Hakama brought the key to her eyes and shrugged. This one? Probably. Some incredible person gave it to their family a long time ago. This thing was passed down from generation to generation. It was believed that if the village was in danger, it would help call upon the guardian god and save them all. The protagonist mentally noted, I see. So this is how it works, and here he can rely on him. They pulled him along again, and he followed. After some time, a huge bonfire was lit in the center of the village. Hakama waved her hand, urging everyone on. Here, quickly. They continued to pull the protagonist, and the gathered villagers whispered among themselves. One of them muttered, so this is really the guardian god? They must be joking. He looks like a lesser being, no matter how you look at him. Could such a weakling really defeat the corrupted one? The next second, Saul sharply hit one of the doubters and, clenching his fist, roared, how should they know? They just ran away. The guardian god, he is amazing. Let everyone remember that. Hakama sighed quietly and said, look who's talking. Danpo put his hand to his chest and, smiling softly, said it was as if he had become a completely different person. At that moment, the grandmother approached them and calmly said, so this is where he is. Hakama turned to her. The grandmother firmly said she wants to officially thank him on behalf of the entire village. The father stepped forward and added, without him, the village would not have survived. They want to thank him somehow. The protagonist placed his hand on his chest and quietly replied, it's not worth it. Father wanted to object, but the protagonist cut him off. If they really want to do something for him, give him information. He wants to learn more about this world. The grandmother asked thoughtfully, about this world then? She tilted her head slightly and said, in that case, he should go to the capital of the kingdom. The protagonist asked in surprise. The capital? She nodded. Where the king who rules this country, Kulmosia, lives. People from all over the world gather there. They will be able to tell him about what is happening in the world. The villagers of Kodama also sometimes go there to sell silk goods. The road is long and difficult, but she is sure the guardian god can handle it. The protagonist frowned slightly and said, but he doesn't know where to go. Then the grandmother gently placed her hand on Hakama's head and said, he can take her as a guide. She had been to the capital before. The protagonist looked at the girl in surprise and asked, have you ever been to the capital? The grandmother quietly continued, as he probably already noticed, Hakama possesses sacred power. There's an academy in the capital that helps develop such abilities. She had once had to leave her studies, but she wished she could return there. MC mentally noted, so schools exist in this era too. At that moment, Sauls resolutely approached them, holding his hand out in front of him and shouting loudly, wait a minute, he's supposed to be the guardian god's guide. Shandy called out to his brother in alarm, Sauls, don't. The grandmother shook her head and calmly said, he has no business in the capital. Sauls chuckled, and he's planning to become a paladin. She sighed heavily and remarked, they didn't even accept him into the academy. He'll never make it. He clenched his fist again and angrily shouted, what did she say, old woman? The protagonist calmly asked, so, sacred power alone isn't enough to get into the academy. Hakama shrugged and replied, there are still written exams to be completed. Sauls is a fool, he failed that. He replied, I see. He thought for a moment. Paladins, yes, that's interesting. He even wants to know more about it. Meanwhile, in the dense forest, Argus Wilton dismounted from his horse, holding the reins tightly. He turned to the girl and asked, so those huge distorted ones that appeared near the village, they really destroyed them? The girl nodded confidently. Exactly. Argus insistently asked, are you sure? She confirmed. Exactly. In fact, she was just about to leave to report to the guildmaster. Argus paused for a second, considering what he had heard. He had come here thinking that even a dozen paladins couldn't cope with such a monster. He was in a hurry, waiting for the reports, but he didn't expect anyone to be able to defeat him. The girl scratched her head and said, still, running into a paladin in such a remote place? What a coincidence, huh? At that very moment, a huge monster appeared from the shadows of the trees behind her. Argus swung his weapon with lightning speed, rushed forward, and with one precise blow cut the monster in two. Lowering his sword, he quietly said, "If all this is true, I wonder." He wants to see this man in person. After some time, the protagonist came out of the room and said, "Beautiful morning. What pleasant air." He never thought he would ever be able to enjoy such a view. Shielding his eyes from the sun with his hand, he quietly added, "I wish Kagura could see this." At that moment, Shandi approached him from behind, holding a stack of clothes in his hands, and said, "Protector God, these are his clothes. Please put these on." A little while later, everyone gathered at the exit of the village. The grandmother, turning to her granddaughter, said, "She must be a good guide for him." Hakama calmly replied, "Okay." Saul stood with his arms crossed over his chest, looking off to the side. He muttered quietly, "He would learn a lot if he went with the guardian god." Grandmother immediately snapped. He should have picked up his textbooks. He grumbled in response, "Shut up already." The protagonist looked at Saul's and calmly asked, "Saul's, right? He fought well yesterday. He will be waiting for him in the capital." Saul's raised his head in surprise, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and he cried out passionately, "He will do his best in his studies." At that moment, the father approached the protagonist and, shaking his hand firmly, said, "Guardian God, please take care of Hakama." Then he knelt before his daughter, and placing his hand on her shoulder, quietly said, "Hakama, the main thing is to take care of your health, okay?" She briefly replied, "Yeah." After that, they headed towards the path. Hakama waved her hand towards the road and said, "Well then, they're off." The other villagers waved them off, and the protagonist and Hakama began their journey. Along the way, they stopped near a waterfall, gazing in awe at the towering mountains, and later sat by a campfire, snacking at a rest stop. MC asked, "How far is it to the capital?" Hakama took a bite of her food and replied, 4 more days on foot." The protagonist smiled. Closer than he thought. Then Hakama called out to him, "Hey, guardian god." He looked at her questioningly. She asked, "Why does he want to know about the world?" He paused slightly and replied, "It's a secret." She quietly repeated, "A secret then?" MC looked down and thought, "The corrupted ones won't die out." So said Kagura, and they really do exist in this era. Originally, they were supposed to appear only during severe pollution, but something had clearly changed here. Hakama frowned. The protector god, he had such a terrifying expression. He immediately caught himself and apologized. He was simply lost in thought. He noted to himself, at least the corrupted ones had not yet overrun the world. People were living and even thriving in this era. First, he needed to understand how people were currently fighting the corrupted ones, and he would deal with his problems gradually. He was silent for a moment, and then asked, "By the way, maybe we should stop calling him the protector god?" Hakama looked at him in surprise. "What should she call him?" He answered, "Simply Sito." She bowed her head slightly. "Lord?" He smiled without lord. She quietly repeated, "Sito." The next second they heard the clatter of hooves. A horse was approaching them. Argus reined in his horse and said, he apologized for disturbing their rest. He looked at the protagonist and asked, "Can I talk to him?" The protagonist raised an eyebrow slightly. "Who is he?" Argus calmly answered, "The captain of the 7th squad of royal paladins from the capital. His name is Argus." MC asked again, "A paladin?" The thought flashed through his mind. So that's what they're like. Then Karina jumped out from behind Argus, clutching the hilt of her sword. She sharply shouted, "How dare he speak to the captain of the paladins like that? He should at least stand up when speaking to him. This is unacceptable." Argus sighed wearily and firmly said, "That's enough, Karina." He stepped forward, again apologized for speaking without dismounting, and asked, "Can they talk?" Extending his hand, he added, "First, he would like to know where they're from and where they're going." Sito, without standing or looking up from his meal, calmly answered, "They're from Kodama village. They are heading to the capital." He asked again, "From Kodama village?" At that very moment, Karina jumped off her horse, drew her sword, and frowning shouted, "Their registries don't record the birth of lower beings in Kodama village. How did he even get there? A damn lower being." The protagonist froze, his mouth slightly open in amazement, and thought, do they keep birth registries? In this country, people are kept on a short leash. Then Argus calmly said, "No." Karina cried out in surprise. "Huh?" He tilted his head slightly and explained, the clothes she was wearing were a specialty of Kodama village. Kodama fabric. They know about it in the capital. It's famous for its high quality and sells for a good price. Children's clothing made from this fabric is rarely found on the market, so most likely, the girl is telling the truth about where she's from. Karina stubbornly objected, but still. Argus slowly reached for his weapon and added, "However, he is different." With these words, he pointed his sword at the protagonist and continued, he had never seen such clothing. What country was he from? Bandit attacks are common on the road from the village to the capital. They use children to steal goods, pretending to be peaceful travelers and then striking. Perhaps he was playing the same game now? Hakama screamed in horror. "That's not true. They are not bandits." Argus replied coldly, "That remains to be proven." The next second, Hakama sharply concentrated energy in her palms. Argus immediately warned, "Don't do anything you might regret." At that moment, several magical swords silently closed around Hakama's neck. She jerked in fear and stared at Argus. He bowed his head slightly and calmly noted, "So she possesses sacred power. Looks promising." MC mentally noted, "This is the power of a paladin. Clearly, he is truly strong." Argus, without lowering his sword and still looking at the protagonist, firmly ordered, "Now it's him. Answer. Where is he from? His future fate depends on his answer." The protagonist looked seriously at Argus, was silent, and then sighed loudly and said, "He is from the village of Kodama." Karina indignantly shouted, "What? This is a lie!" Argus put the sword in its sheath and calmly said, I understand, Karina screamed. What, Captain? Argus looked at Hakama and asked, is this true, right? Hakama looked away and then firmly said, Sito is the guardian god of Kodama village. Argus turned and thought, a guardian god? He said out loud, I see. He walked up to his horse. MC asked, is the interrogation over? Argus answered, aha. He started to jump on his horse and added, he's just doing his job. I apologize for being rude. Karina continued to be indignant. Captain? Argus asked, were they going to the capital? The protagonist answered, yes. Argus added, so they will meet again. If you need help, you can ask. This is by way of apology for today. Karina shouted, Captain? Argus rode on and said, it's time for them to go. See you later. Karina looked after him indignantly and shouted, is he serious now? Captain. They set off, but Karina did not calm down. She shouted, why did he just let them go? He looked wildly suspicious. And a lower being too, Argus thought, lower beings, and quietly added, he would not be so sure which of them was weaker. Karina was surprised and exclaimed, Ria was riding next to him and agreed with him. He was right. Karina looked at her in surprise and shouted, and she too, Ria? Ria answered, she is wrong. Didn't she feel it? Argus said, he tried to get close to him 3 times, but he reacted faster than he could even begin. He wanted to repeat what he did to that girl, but the spirits refused to help him. Ria added, her too. Karina shouted, this means? Argus said, this means that there is a huge gap in sacred power between them. The only one among all the paladins capable of such a thing is the Grand Captain, at the very least. Karina clenched her teeth and shouted, she didn't notice anything. Argus calmly added, he is far superior to them, that's all. She just joined the squad. There is no need to worry. Ria asked, about the distorted Kodama in the village. Do you think it is him? Argus answered, most likely. Karina asked, and they will really just leave him? Argus said, they don't know who he is, but he does not seem like a bad person to him. Let him roam free for now. Right now, it is more important to return to the capital. Let the problems with the distorted one be solved faster than they expected. Let the guild deal with the bandits. They are counting on them. Argus thought, so, the village's protector god. If he becomes their ally, he could be useful in solving serious problems. After some time, MC looked at Hakama, who was walking ahead, and asked, how did she like that night? It was interesting, right? Do you think all the paladins in the capital are so strong? Hakama replied, he is special. Among knights, only the best become paladins, and he is the best even among the best. The speed of his spiritual arts is on a completely different level. She began waving her hands, demonstrating the movements. The protagonist asked, spiritual arts? Hakama explained, sacred power is something bestowed by spirits, and the techniques for using this power are called spiritual arts. The protagonist answered, I see. He thought, so they don't consider nanomachines spirits. In this era, science is considered magic. Then he remembered Karina pointing a sword at him and screaming furiously, he's a damn inferior being, and he said, inferior being. It seems there are many races in this era. Hakama confirmed, yeah, some are more like fish, others like bugs. The protagonist asked, bugs? Hakama replied, Grandma said that a long time ago, humans were limited to habitats. Their bodies slowly changed to adapt to the environment. The protagonist asked in surprise, so they adapted to the environment? He thought, that means there were survivors 100 million years ago. They evolved from the remnants of humanity. There is no point in thinking about it now. Out loud, he said, yeah, those who have not changed are considered inferior beings. Hakama replied, right. Compared to those who have adapted to the environment, they are weaker in every way. That is why they are despised. Most of the slaves are from inferior beings. MC thought, so there is slavery here. Hakama said, they're not that different from them. Treating those who are different badly is wrong. They're all wrong. She made an offended face. The protagonist smiled softly and remarked, she's a good child. She looked up at him. The next second, a desperate cry rang out. Poval started calling for help. At that very moment, she dropped her cane and collapsed to the ground. Hakama rushed to her and shouted, is she okay? The protagonist looked at Poval in surprise and quietly said, look at her ears. They carefully turned the girl onto her back. MC leaned over her and thought, she's covered in bruises, terrible injuries. Hakama lifted Poval and asked worriedly, is she okay? The protagonist concentrated energy in his hand and calmly said, hold on, he will heal her. But at that very second, Poval put a knife to Hakama's neck and barked, don't move. If he moved, she'd cut her. And him too. The protagonist thought calmly, I see. They'd walked right into a trap. He glanced to the side and mentally added, that means they're nearby. The ones capable of something like this. The next moment, Valentine began to emerge from invisibility. He chuckled and said, excellent work, Poval. She did as he ordered. A few more bandits stepped forward. MC noted to himself, invisible camouflage, a nanomachine function. It projects the surroundings onto the body, creating the illusion of transparency. The downside is that the illusion immediately dissipates upon movement, but they made good use of it. Valentine pointed his sword at the protagonist and coldly said, too fashionable clothes for a lowly creature. What country did he come from? Don't move, Hakama called out anxiously. Sito, Valentine chuckled and asked, do you know what will happen otherwise? Hakama tried to concentrate the energy in her hand again, but the protagonist sharply shouted her name. She froze in surprise. He firmly said, this is the power for fighting the distorted ones. She understands that it can't be used against humans, right? She wanted to object, but Valentine interrupted her with a chuckle. That's right. He didn't think he'd run into someone with sacred power. By the way, the bandit approached MC and asked, "Can he use it too?" He calmly replied, "Who knows?" The man flushed, "What?" and immediately kicked the protagonist in the stomach. Hakama screamed, "Cedo!" The bandit barked, "Don't be insolent, lesser being." Then Valentine intervened and coldly ordered, "Don't damage the goods." He grumbled, "They won't give much for a lesser being anyway." Valentine narrowed his eyes. "What if he can use sacred power?" The bandit snorted, "Lesser being? Never." Hakama thought in horror. These guys are the very bandits the paladin talked about, slave traders. Valentine again concentrated his energy and stepped towards Hakama. He muttered, "She's going to lie down for a while and get some sleep." She thought in a panic, if they get caught, they might be made slaves. After some time, she heard the MC's voice. "Hakama, wake up!" He called her again and again. She opened her eyes, looked at him in shock and whispered, "Cedo?" Sitting up, she looked around and realized they were in a cage. The protagonist quietly asked, "Is she okay?" She answered, "Yes." But something else was more important. "Where are they?" The protagonist looked around the room and said, "This is the base of the guys who attacked them. It looks like they bring everyone they captured here." The room was lined with cages containing exhausted people. Hakama frowned and suddenly asked, "Why is he naked?" The MC, sitting opposite, calmly answered, "They liked his unusual clothes." She stared at him. He was too calm. He shrugged slightly. He had lived more than one life. He had managed to get used to a lot. Hakama said she was more interested in why he didn't defend himself. He could have easily dealt with them. He looked at her silently, then quietly said, "Forget it." At that moment, the door to the room creaked open. Poval entered, carrying a tray of food, and said indifferently, "They're awake." Hakama lunged at the bars and screamed, "It's her! She orchestrated all of this." Poval abruptly dropped the tray to the floor and muttered, "She might hate her. She doesn't expect them to forgive her." Her face contorted with tension. The protagonist calmly said, "She's too kind to be a real villain." Poval flinched. "Kind? What does he mean?" He bowed his head slightly. "Real villains don't think like that. They don't care whether they're hated or not, forgiven or not." Then he rose to his feet and added, "In any case." He gripped the bars tightly. Poval froze, looking at him in bewilderment. The next second, the bars of the cage crumbled with a crash. MC dusted off his hands and said calmly, he was waiting for her to appear. They would talk where no one could overhear. Poval asked in surprise, "With her?" The protagonist stepped forward and asked firmly, "Where are they keeping the one she holds dear?" She froze, looking at him in bewilderment. How did he know? He bowed his head slightly and replied, he guessed. Concentrating energy in his hand, he instantly healed all her wounds and bruises. Then he said, he fell for the trick because her wounds were real. But even bandits usually don't beat their own just to use them as bait. He quickly understood everything. She follows their orders because they threaten someone dear to her. She lowered her gaze and said, "Her little brother, he is with them now. They said, if she doesn't obey, he will be sent into slavery, and they will never meet again. And their parents, those bastards, just killed them." Her voice broke. She clenched her fists and burst into tears. Through her tears, she screamed, she must protect her brother. That's why she does everything they tell her. At that moment, the protagonist clenched his fists, gritted his teeth, and thought, idiots. Hakama looked at him and quietly asked, did he let himself be captured on purpose? To save everyone here? He nodded briefly, including. But scum like these aren't that easy to get rid of. They're like oil stains. She frowned. Oil stains? He answered yes. It's enough to destroy just one, and they'll gather their strength again. The evil will continue. At that moment, the guard behind the door jerked sharply. He heard a noise in the room. MC added coldly, if we get rid of them, we need to tear them out by the roots, all at once. With these words, he kicked down the door with a powerful blow, throwing the guards aside and stepped into the corridor. And they will start right now. When it came to scum, no one understood them better than him. 100 million years ago, the protagonist stood on the street. Initially, he was someone who was truly inspired by the idea of justice. But very soon, he realized the world that so desperately needed it was overflowing with scum, just like those he encountered every day. At that moment, a man smoking a cigarette approached him and roughly grabbed him by the clothes, yanking him forward. It flashed through his mind. If he lived a normal life, nothing terrible would have happened. But the environment in which he grew up did not allow that, and so he crushed them, one after another. The next second, the man's arms snapped, breaking under his grip. He struck after strike, without stopping. Even as an adult, he continued to do the same, until one day, someone told him he was born in the wrong world. It was Kagura. He extended his hand, and everything changed. In the present, the MC grabbed a guard by the hair, throwing him aside with a sharp movement, and immediately advanced on the next one. One of the bandits, clutching a bat, screamed, "Don't come any closer. What does he want? How did he even get here?" Defeated guards lay around. There were already many of them. The protagonist yanked another opponent sharply, yanking him forward, straight into the arms of his comrade. He barely managed to catch his colleague. The protagonist swung and struck with such force that the guard flew straight into the door, leaving deep cracks. The last of the remaining conscious bandits backed away, screaming, "Who the hell is he?" His eyes were full of terror. At that moment, a deafening scream echoed throughout the building. Poval pressed her hand to her chest, muttering in alarm. Those screams. She turned sharply to Hakama. "Who is her friend really?" Hakama answered firmly, "He is a protective god." Poval let out a stunned breath. A god? She nodded. They have nothing to worry about with Sito. Now just do what he said. Get everyone out. She rushed towards the exit along with the other freed slaves. On the way, she briefly thought, could they really get out of here? But this man, he's insanely strong. It is not just sacred power and not just physical strength. Nothing will help against him. At this time, Valentine, trembling with tension, put his hand in front of him and shouted, "Stop!" He stared at the protagonist, who was holding one of the guards by the head, and shouted, "What does he want? Money? Slaves?" Sharply pointing his finger at the cage with the children, he yelled, "He can take as much as he wants." MC looked at him coldly and calmly asked, "Is he finished bargaining?" With these words, he casually tossed the guard aside. Valentine gritted his teeth, panicking. What's going on? Why aren't his spiritual arts working? What kind of power does this guy even have? The protagonist stepped closer and said coldly, "He was lucky to be such a talentless bandit. Real scumbags run away as soon as they sense danger. People like him, on the other hand, look down on everyone, think they're important, and as soon as real trouble starts, they try to bargain." Valentine pursed his lips, thinking frantically, damn, is there still a chance? No. With that thought, he darted to the side and, grabbing the lever, yanked it down with all his might. The huge door swung open with a bang, revealing a massive cage. MC froze for a moment, mentally noting, "Distorted?" Valentine hoarsely shouted. He had a special order. Someone special. The cage clanged open, and the monster advanced heavily. Valentine shouted, if he didn't want to bargain, then he would simply destroy him. The monster roared deafeningly and raised its huge paw to strike, but the protagonist raised his hands, brutally blocking the blow. Valentine froze, not believing his eyes. How is this possible? The protagonist said coldly, "He has a superhuman body. He was told that his muscles have several times more fibers than an ordinary person, and when it comes to distorted ones, he does not have to restrain his sacred power." With these words, he threw his hand forward, releasing a wave of pure energy, powerful, blinding, incinerating. The monster crumbled to ash without even having time to howl. Valentine, covered in cold sweat, thought in horror, can he really use this power? The protagonist took another step forward and, clenching his fist, calmly asked, "What is he going to do now?" Valentine's face contorted with fear. He folded his trembling hands in front of himself. Maybe he should just let go? The next second, MC delivered one short, crushing blow and coldly answered, "No." After some time, MC adjusted his cloak and calmly said, "That's it." He mentally noted that he finally had his clothes back and breathed a sigh of relief. His gaze slid to the hole in the wall. There, among the rubble, lay Valentine. Then the protagonist turned to the cage with the children and quietly said, "Sorry, you'll have to wait a little longer. He will get them all out of here." The children looked at him with hope and joy. MC approached the table with the documents and added, "First, he needs to check something. It is very important to collect evidence of their crimes." He opened the cabinet in the desk, noticed a stack of papers, and muttered in surprise, "Oh." Leaning on the table, he began to leaf through the documents and thought to himself, "Aha, here it is." Taking a closer look at the strange symbols on the pages, he said, "I see," and then mentally added, he doesn't know how to read these signs. He doesn't understand a word of them. He will have to ask Hakama to teach him. After that, he approached the remains of the monster and, laying his hand on it, wondered, what were they planning to do with the distorted one? He needed to find out. Directing a stream of energy at the remains, he summoned a multitude of translucent screens in front of him. The thought flashed through his mind. Access to the cameras of the machines flying here. Recordings are stored for up to a week. His eyes widened in surprise when a conversation flashed on one of the screens. Valentine was telling someone, "But my lord, what does he plan to do with such a creature?" And in response, the calm voice of Chapion sounded, "He doesn't need to know. Although he can say, something very interesting will happen in this country quite soon. Something completely incredible." Meanwhile, on the street, Poval stood, looking away, and suddenly cried out loudly, "Nino!" The boy, his eyes full of tears, rushed to her, shouting, "Little sister." She burst into tears too, and they hugged tightly. Poval sobbed, "Thank God." They looked up at the protagonist, and Poval cried out through her tears, "Oh God, thank him so much." MC bowed his head slightly and calmly replied, "He's not a god, and no thanks." Then he turned his head slightly and asked, "By the way, who usually arrests bandits? The Lord's soldiers?" Hakama shook her head. "No, that's the guild's job. Over there is the head of the local guild." He answered briefly, "I see." A large, powerful man, Podrak, approached them and asked firmly, "So it was they who caused such chaos here?" MC nodded. "Aha." The man bowed slightly and said, "He is the head of the guild. Thank you for helping us catch that gang. They did the city a great service." Looking up at the protagonist, he mentally noted, he looks like a lower being, but his instincts screamed that he was far from an ordinary person. He added out loud, "They received dozens of reports of the damage they were causing. Requests for their extermination came one after another, but no one could even get close to them." The protagonist chuckled. "So the guild is in charge of arrests here, not the lords?" Podrak put his hand on his hip and grinned. He must be joking. The lords didn't have that kind of power. Dealing with criminals is the job of the guild, which reports directly to the king. Even if the lord who governs these lands commits a crime, the guild is obliged to report everything to his majesty. Although, of course, he is unlikely to be capable of such a thing. The protagonist mentally translated this into the language of his world. So the lord here is like the mayor, and the guild is like the police. So Chapion. He handed Podrak a scroll. "Here are the documents he found. Do you think this will help?" Podrak unrolled the scroll and suddenly exhaled sharply. This is a list of everyone the bandits had done business with. With this, they'll be able to track them down and capture them one by one. MC tilted his head slightly. Is the Lord's name on there? Podrak immediately became serious. He shouldn't take such speculation seriously. Of course, he wasn't there. The protagonist frowned and thought, I see, the real villain always remains in the shadows. Nothing can be done about it now. But there are more important things. He gently placed his hand on Nino's head and calmly asked, what will happen to the freed slaves? The guild leader shrugged. Those for whom inquiries were received or who belong to famous families, the guild will return home. As for the rest, nothing can be done about that. MC sighed quietly and thought, if he remembered correctly, these two lost their parents. He looked up. Are there any shelters here? Podrak answered. No, they can help find work, but for lesser creatures it will be difficult. The protagonist gritted his teeth, hearing that disdainful, inferior creature-like language again. He thought, he wants to help them. But what if no one wants to take them in? Suddenly, his head snapped up, as if a realization had struck him. Turning to Poval and Nino, he asked, if he could find a safe place for them where they would be fed and given a roof over their heads, would they agree to go there? Poval clenched her fists and firmly shouted, yes, of course. Does he have something in mind? He calmly answered, yes. He remembered Shandi's promise. He had an excellent option. Sometime later, the capital of the Kalmosia kingdom, Argus's estate. Argus was leading his horse by the bridle and suddenly froze, as if a sudden tremor had run through him. Rhea, walking next to him, asked anxiously, is something wrong? He answered, no, nothing, just a shudder. He dismounted, looked at the others, and briefly said, that's all. He wished them luck on the expedition. Everyone should rest today. Then he headed toward the mansion. The servants bowed. Welcome, Sir Argus. He walked further, handed the suitcase to the butler, and asked casually. Nothing strange had happened while he was gone. The butler and several subordinates exchanged awkward glances. Argus sighed heavily. Something had happened. The butler bowed again. He apologized for having to report this to him immediately upon his return. And he explained the essence of the problem. Liasmiria watched them silently from above. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed on them. Argus waved his hand. Understood. Thank you for the report. The subordinate quietly replied, no need to thank, sir. When everyone dispersed, Argus pressed his palm to his forehead and sighed heavily again. The thought flashed through his mind. It's worse than he thought. The warped one in the capital. How did he get here? No, most likely someone brought him there on purpose. In that case, the main suspect is the Harnisk Academy. They stubbornly refuse to allow outsiders in. That means he needs allies, and he needs them fast. 3 days after the incident with the bandits, MC was walking along the road with his new comrades. Poval glanced at him and quietly asked, does he really think there's work for people like them in the capital? He replied softly, don't worry. She can read, write, and she's good at math too. There will be work, just believe in yourself. She happily raised her head. Okay. Suddenly Hakama pointed forward. Sito, look, you can see it now. The protagonist froze, and then his eyes widened. Before them, over the edge of the cliff, lay a huge city. He muttered, so this is the capital. After a while, they were walking along a bustling city street. Poval turned her head in all directions, unable to hide her amazement. It was so lively here. Hakama, pointing somewhere to the side again, explained, the capital relies on imports for everything. You can find goods from all over the world here. She raised a finger, emphasizing the thought. And the people from their village also bring their products here to sell. The protagonist nodded. Yes, she said so. He thought to himself, interesting. In this new world, different races and cultures have mixed. That's immediately obvious. The streets are clean, orderly, but there are still problems. At that moment, his gaze slid into a dark alley where several poor people huddled together. He thought, it's like this in any era. Somewhere life is in full swing, and somewhere there's barely enough strength to just survive. He turned to Hakama. By the way, when do the entrance exams for the academy begin? She answered, in a week. He calmly said, so they still have a little time. They walked a little further, and Hakama added, enrollment takes place immediately after the exam. Somewhere behind them, in the shadows of an alley, Miria was watching them. She frowned and thought, to Harnisk Academy? And with a child and a lesser being too? Were they serious? Later, in a modest room at the inn, Nino and Hakama jumped onto the bed with a joyful squeal. MC sat down next to Hakama and breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, they had proper beds. She agreed with him. The protagonist glanced around the room and thought they had made it to the capital, as planned. But what to do now? His gaze fell on the bag of coins. He thought, no matter what he decided, he would need money. They had received a reward for helping with the bandits, but it wouldn't last long. The main thing now was to find work for these two. The easiest way would be to approach that man, but without connections, it would be difficult to get through to him. He sighed quietly and got out of bed. He decided, first, it was worth learning more about this world, especially about the distorted ones. If someone was using them for shady deeds, they couldn't turn a blind eye to it. He wouldn't let what happened to his world happen again. Turning to Hakama, he asked, when people here need to know something, what do they usually do? She answered, they ask someone or read books. Raising a finger, she added, only books are expensive here. In their village, they shared what they had, and in the capital, there is a library. He can go there. He said, a library then. He thought, convenient. He will take advantage of this. Maybe he will find some clues, or even traces of the laboratories left by Kagura. After some time, the group approached the library building. The employee, smiling politely, shook her head. She apologizes, but they cannot access the books. They are considered a national treasure, not for just anyone to touch. Only academy students and nobles living in the capital have access. The protagonist sighed quietly. I see. Hakama added awkwardly. Besides, Sito can't read yet. The protagonist silently agreed. Exactly. Hakama had taught him the letters, tat, but he was still a long way from fluent reading. What should he do now? At that moment, several mercenaries were warming up nearby and quietly chatting. One of them nodded towards the group. It's them, right? A group of lesser beings with a child? Definitely them. After that, they loudly called out to the travelers. One mercenary, sharply swinging his arm, jumped to attack, aiming his fist at MC. But the protagonist easily intercepted his hand and calmly said, strange way to introduce themselves. He thought, something is wrong here. The guy standing a little to the side hastily said, he just got it all wrong. In response, MC squeezed his wrist a little harder, and a stream of energy flew into the sky. The mercenary shook his head and chuckled. Excellent reaction, old man. He glanced sideways at the children and thought, he didn't expect it. Are they really going to use sacred power right in the middle of the street? The MC looked at him coldly. So what do they want from him? The mercenary shrugged. Their client considers him a nuisance. The protagonist silently noted, so they hired mercenaries. Well, that would even save him time. The second guy chuckled. If they simply disappeared, the capital would be calmer. No longer would there be danger lurking around every corner. He especially should think about what would happen next. He swung again, but the MC instantly grabbed his arm, flipped him over with a sharp movement, and threw him to the ground. The second mercenary, throwing up his hands, concentrated his energy and shouted, he asked for it. A stream of flame erupted from his palms, rushing towards the protagonist. But he merely casually extended his palm forward, and the stream of fire dissipated, as if it had hit an invisible wall. The mercenary bared his teeth, retreating into the clouds of smoke. The next moment, MC's hand shot out of the smoke. He grabbed his opponent by the chest and jerked him into the air. He said coldly, if you want to become a threat, first become stronger. If of course he has the courage to repeat it. With these words, he swung slightly, as if about to strike. The mercenary thought in horror, isn't he a lesser being? And then a sharp, commanding voice rang out, enough, nobody move. Karina stood a few steps away, hands on her hips. She scratched the back of her head and petulantly drawled, seriously. They started a fight in the middle of the city when she was trying to at least enjoy a little of her day off. She'll throw them all behind bars, so get ready. MC immediately let go of the mercenary and then suddenly smiled broadly. Excellent. He deliberately made a fuss. Karina sharply pointed her finger at him. It's him. That same lesser one. Karina smirked, pointing her weapon at him, and added coldly, it was very brave of him to cause a ruckus as soon as he reached the capital. After all, inferior beings remain inferior. He doesn't even know what is and isn't allowed here. At that moment, an unfamiliar girl approached her and calmly said, she was just passing by and saw everything. These people were attacked. Honestly, she thought it was pure self-defense. Karina glanced at her in confusion, then crouched down next to the fallen mercenaries and muttered, she seemed to recognize them. They were students from the Harness Academy, right? She clutched her head and sighed heavily. She knew it. She hoped at least the lady wasn't involved. MC frowned. The lady? Karina waved her hand, as if brushing off unnecessary questions, and ordered her subordinates, take them away. Just thinking out loud, forget it. The protagonist calmly said, so the paladins patrol the streets too. He thought the guild did that. Karina answered briefly, the capital is big. They just help maintain order. She thought to herself, she was just strolling around here, trying the street food, and yet he really is incredibly strong. Waving her hand again, she muttered, in short, try not to cause any more trouble. But the MC suddenly raised his hand. Wait, if you don't mind, tell me where a certain place is. Karina turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. What place? A while later, the MC was sitting on the couch in Argus's estate. He folded his hands in front of him and said firmly, he needs to hire them. He told me to come to him if I needed help, remember? Argus raised an eyebrow in surprise. Was it his imagination, or were there more of them than before? The protagonist tilted his head slightly. It just happened that way. They ran into the very bandits they'd warned them about. They'd held these children captive. They'd freed them. Argus frowned. What about the bandits? He replied. He dealt with them. The guild was already working on the rest. The paladin looked at him thoughtfully, and thought to himself, did he handle them all alone? Out loud he wondered, why did he bring them here? MC glanced at Poval and Nino. They're without family, what they call lesser beings here. He thought he could at least help them find work. Argus said, he wasn't obligated to take responsibility for other people's children. He replied, this is just how he lives. He saved them and doesn't want to abandon them halfway. If I started, I'll see it through. The children froze, looking at him hopefully. Argus closed his eyes, was silent for a couple of seconds and then exhaled. Good. They can stay and work in the estate. Poval couldn't help but exclaim joyfully, really? Argus added sternly, but on one condition. Everyone tensed involuntarily. He said, he will become an instructor. MC frowned slightly. Instructor? A little later, Nino and Poval changed into work clothes. The protagonist, crossing his arms over his chest, nodded. It looked good on them. Poval bowed low, almost touching her nose to the floor. Sir Argus, thank you very much. Argus waved his hand. Don't thank him. He looked at his subordinates and firmly added, and he expects them to teach them everything, without any discrimination, just because they are from lower beings. They bowed their heads in unison. As you command. The group moved further down the corridors of the estate. MC slowed his pace slightly and quietly asked, so what's the reason? Why should he be the instructor? Argus stopped, turned to him, and calmly replied, he grasps everything incredibly quickly. He doesn't know who he is, but he wants to believe he's a worthy man. That's why he's asking for his help. He paused, as if choosing his words, and added, he needs you to infiltrate the Harness Academy. The protagonist froze. What do you mean? Argus stopped at the heavy carved door and, lowering his voice slightly, explained, this country is now a battlefield, where several factions are waging a hidden war. The king is ill and won't last long. Behind the scenes, a battle for the throne is already underway. He looked down. The problem is that some who have no right to the inheritance are still striving for power. They are using the corrupted, drawing innocent people into this, turning them into weapons. The protagonist nodded quietly, mentally noting, I see. So that lord wasn't the only one involved in this. It's much bigger than that. The paladin added, the most dangerous players are hiding here, in the capital, operating from the shadows. They need to uncover them as soon as possible. MC narrowed his eyes slightly. The most suspicious place is Harness Academy? Argus stopped by the door, turned around and answered firmly, exactly. Then he knocked and, opening the door slightly, said, she will help them get inside. He will introduce her. His younger sister studies there. Her name is Miria. A girl with a fan sat by the window in the room. Miria. She barely glanced at the people who entered before raising an eyebrow. Brother, is he seriously saying he's going to rely on this lowly creature to infiltrate the academy, as he's planning? Argus raised his voice sharply. Miria, that's rude. She merely shrugged. The very existence of such creatures within the academy's walls was rude. She could understand this village girl, but a lowly creature as an instructor? Unthinkable. MC sighed quietly and calmly remarked, she's too biased, young lady. Argus lowered his head. I'm sorry. Don't take it to heart. Karina leaned towards the protagonist and added in a whisper, she's a genius, but terribly biased towards inferior beings. He replied, he already understood that. Miria flicked her fan. Brother, does he even understand how difficult it is to infiltrate the academy? And if he becomes a teacher, he'll have to not just be listed there, but actually teach classes. Does he really think this lowly creature can teach anything? Hakama stepped forward. Sito can't read. Miria rolled her eyes. Can't read? Then what kind of teaching are we talking about? But Hakama continued firmly. Even so, there are things only Sito can teach. Things that can't be found in books. Things that are more important than any words. Miria silently looked at the protagonist, as if trying to discern something worthy in him. Then she slowly walked past, remarking as she went, well, at least he's strong enough to keep the students in line. But that alone isn't enough for the role of teacher. With these words, she left, quietly closing the door behind her. Karina scratched her head. Those students, then, were his doing after all. Argus sighed heavily, placing his palm to his forehead. Forgive me. He would have a serious talk with her about this later. MC replied calmly, no need to worry. He tilted his head slightly. So what exactly did he want him to teach? Argus looked him straight in the eyes. Spiritual arts. From what he had seen, he was incredibly strong in it. Or was he wrong? The protagonist frowned slightly. What exactly should he teach in spiritual arts? He replied, just the basics. Fire, lightning, ice, healing. If he can use at least 2 of the 4 basic elements, that will be enough for the beginner course. MC asked. Just? Argus suddenly leaned forward. Just? Could it be that he possesses special spiritual arts? Ones that only a few can access? The protagonist froze for a moment, then calmly said, special spiritual arts. He thought, so that man is considered outstanding even for this era. He tilted his head slightly and said, interesting, but fine. He'll have to shake up the common sense of this era a little. A week later, the entrance exam at the Harness Academy. Applicants were receiving their tickets outside, while Hakama concentrated on completing test assignments. After a while, Ludman approached Argus in the hallway and said calmly, thank you for coming. The 7th Paladin squad must be especially busy right now. Argus calmly replied, nothing special. It's just their turn today. MC came closer and quietly asked, turn? What do you mean? Argus explained, once a year, the Paladin squads alternate. Which one sends their man as a special instructor? This year, it's the 7th squad's turn. The protagonist frowned slightly and thought, is he sure he's the best choice? At that moment, Ludman looked at him carefully, then waved his hand towards the door. This way, please. The director is waiting for them. The door swung open. The director of the academy sat behind a massive desk. She folded her hands in front of her and bowed her head slightly. Argus bowed. Long time no see, director. She smiled warmly. Ever since he graduated at the top of his class, he'd grown into a remarkable man. She was glad he continued to help them with his strength. He replied curtly, it's his duty. The director leaned forward slightly, resting her palms on the armrests of her chair. She'd heard rumors. It seemed they were now fighting not only the corrupted but also getting involved in political squabbles. She paused, as if giving him a chance to justify himself, but when he didn't respond, she continued. She understood that the 7th squad had enough on their plate. They couldn't just pluck someone from the core team. But still, that was no reason to treat the academy's reputation so frivolously. He had to be honest. Was he seriously considering appointing this man as instructor? At these words, everyone's gazes turned to MC. Argus bowed again. You can be sure he is capable of surpassing any fighter of the 7th Division, at least when it comes to combat skills. The headmistress closed her eyes, as if collecting her thoughts. If that was what he thought, but what should she do? And then a sharp voice rang out. Headmistress, he must object. It was Gita. He stepped forward, pointing a finger at the protagonist. In their prestigious sacred academy, lesser beings have never been allowed to hold the position of teacher. He wants to disgrace the academy by appointing someone like him to this post? The headmistress slowly turned her gaze to Ludman. Lord Gita made his position perfectly clear. And what did he, Lord Ludman, think? Ludman bowed his head slightly. He agreed with him. Most of their students are from noble families. If a lesser being teaches them, it will cause a scandal among both students and teachers. The headmistress sighed heavily and waved her hand. Well, in fact, she thinks so herself. But since they had already come, she would listen to them. Then MC stepped forward and, bowing deeply, said he apologized for making her waste her time. He is Sito from Kodama village. The director raised an eyebrow slightly, thinking, how calm. And this after all the insults. MC continued. He understands her concerns, but tell me, if a lesser being is not suitable for training, is it because of his origin, or because he lacks ability? The director slightly tilted her head. If I had to choose between the two reasons, then of course the latter. If he has enough ability, the rest is irrelevant. But can he prove it? Argus said firmly. Then why not arrange a test? Sometime later, at the Academy's spiritual arts training ground, Guita spread his arms out to the sides and said with a wry smile, today is the entrance exam, so the campus is almost empty. At least he won't embarrass himself in front of all the students. MC stared at him silently, expressing neither anger nor excitement. The director stood nearby, arms crossed over her chest. The rules were simple. He would be pitted against one of the instructors. A duel with someone who taught the art himself was the quickest way to test his abilities, right? One of the students stood frozen nearby, his eyes wide. What was going on? He'd heard there was some kind of duel going on, but he'd never seen the Guida teacher fight anyone. The protagonist thought briefly. It was useless to try to prove anything with words. Only strength was valued here. The director lifted her chin slightly. Well, they'd see what this inferior being was capable of. Argus stood staring at the training ground, thinking, now, for the first time, he'd see what he was capable of in a real fight. Inferior beings had weak bodies. Even if they could use sacred power, it was barely noticeable. He hoped he wasn't mistaken. Guida narrowed his eyes at the protagonist and said with a grin, is he ready? Then he'll go first. With these words, he concentrated a huge clot of fiery energy in his palms. The flames rose above him, scorching the air. The next second, he threw this stream straight at MC, but the protagonist only slightly dodged, and the flames flashed past, not touching him by a hair. The students who had managed to make it onto the training ground froze with their mouths open. Gita briefly noted this and thought, a few students had come to watch. Well, let them see how quickly any impudence ends. He immediately reorganized the energy. Now electrical discharges flashed in his hand. With a loud cry, he threw it forward. MC easily jumped back, gracefully somersaulting, avoiding the blow. Guida muttered to himself, dodging is all he knows how to do. A lesser being, he may not have been able to become a paladin, but he had once been the Academy's top student, and he certainly wouldn't lose to someone like him. He unleashed another stream of fire on the protagonist, pouring all his confidence into the blow, and MC continued to dodge, as if dancing amidst the raging elements. He thought to himself, he really doesn't like using this power against people, but it seems there is no choice. And then he began to gather his own energy. He said he will show only a little. The next moment, the space around Guida seemed to shrink. He was suddenly pressed to the ground, and the stone surface beneath him began to crack deeply. Those present froze, unable to believe their eyes. Gita, gasping for breath, thought, what? What was that? One of the students whispered. Did he change the gravity around him? He had never seen such a spiritual art. The protagonist smiled slightly and said calmly, it seems the Academy still has a lot to learn, and not just the students, but all of them. After that, he adjusted the glove on his hand. A second later, Gita, trembling all over, began to rise on his hands. MC snapped his fingers, and Guida cried out, what did he do? The protagonist answered, a spiritual art. Guida finally got to his feet, pointing a finger at him, and cried out, he had never heard of anything like this. This is some kind of trick. MC replied, calm down. The director, observing all this, finally said, she thinks everything is clear. Argus quietly added, indeed. Nearby, Miria stood with her arms crossed and thought it was definitely a special spiritual art. But how? Lesser beings, not blessed by spirits, have almost no sacred power. So who is he really? A week later, the Academy Assembly Hall. The director stood behind the podium, speaking loudly and clearly. At this academy, they teach theory, but their main task is training warriors. To fight the distorted, true fighters are needed. Those who fail will be expelled without delay. But if they complete their training, they will have a chance to join the Order of Paladins. Everything depends only on their abilities. On the balcony, slightly to the side, stood one of the students. Turning to her friend, she quietly said, yeah, there are plenty of commoners here today. She nodded silently, showing no particular interest. Leon approached them, leaned on the railing, and casually said, hi. It's not often you see her at an entrance ceremony. He thought she didn't care about other people at all. She replied dryly, she could say the same about him. Leon chuckled. Well, if there are any noblemen among the newcomers, it's worth getting to know them better. That's why she's here, right? She wanted to answer but suddenly froze, looking down. Leon noticed the protagonist among those present and frowned. Why a lowly being among the teachers? Miria, standing nearby, calmly answered. Because he's a teacher. Leon cried out in surprise. What? Miria tilted her head slightly. What does he think of this man? He replied. What's there to think about? He's simply a lowly being. She said. That's what she thought. At that moment, the protagonist slowly glanced around the hall and thought, the academy is huge, the investigation will take a long time, and the looks here really aren't very friendly. If nothing changes, he will stand out too much, and eventually become the most suspicious here. First, he needs to at least be accepted. Sometime later, Guita was giving a lecture in the study hall. He said, so starting today, we are resuming classes in the spiritual arts, and don't think you can just sit it out. If you hesitate, even the first years will overtake them. They may think they are the elite, but he suddenly pointed his finger at one of the students. What's this? Why are there so few of them today? Do they even want to be here? Miria, crossing her arms over her chest, sighed quietly. Obviously, Gita glanced sideways at the protagonist and thought with a barely perceptible sneer, who would seriously listen to some lowly being here? Gita pointed at the podium. Well, Teacher Sito, please introduce yourself to the students. The MC stepped up to the podium, calmly looked around the audience and said, as they had already heard, his name is Sito. He will be teaching them spiritual arts. He won't promise his lessons will be easy. Leon, leaning back on the bench, chuckled. Does he really think he can handle it? The protagonist slightly closed his eyes. That's up to them. If they think his classes are a waste of time, they don't have to come. The student chuckled, but immediately became wary. And Sito added in an even voice, but there is one thing he can guarantee. He concentrated energy in his palms. He said, spiritual arts are capable of destroying the regenerative ability of the distorted, but it doesn't work the same on human bodies. Only a wound remains, because this power is created for destruction. And that's precisely why it can't be used as a toy. Please remember this. One of the students snorted. Seriously? Power is just power, old man. What can a lesser being say anyway? He says not to use power, so he's just a weakling, no match for them. MC slowly turned his gaze to him, then sighed loudly and distinctly. If they think he's weak, they can test it themselves. The student sat up, narrowing his eyes. What? The protagonist replied. He allows him to use the strongest attack he can against him. Let him hit with full force. If he can even scratch him, he will leave here and never appear again. An excited whisper swept through the hall. Guita covered his head with his hands in horror. Enough. Have they lost their minds? It'll hit him too. But the student wasn't listening anymore. He raised his hand, concentrating a whirlwind of energy, and shouted, he'll regret opening his mouth, you inferior creature, and don't even think about taking that back. A powerful flash rushed forward. For a moment, everything was shrouded in smoke. When the smoke dissipated, it turned out that right behind the student, mere centimeters from his head, a thin dagger had pierced the wall, as if materialized from the energy itself. The student froze, feeling the cold metal against his temple. Sito calmly said, if he wanted to, he'd already be dead. Judging people by their appearance alone is like signing your own death warrant. In this world, no one lives to old age like that. Leon, stunned, wondered, what was that? What spiritual art had he used? The protagonist slowly descended from the podium and stood before the students. He said, they call someone inferior because they consider them weaker, right? And if someone is stronger than them, what should they call them then? He added, teacher. Sito asked if they knew the conditions for activating spiritual arts. He turned to the student who had attacked him and asked him to try to answer this question. The boy stood up, frightened, and said that it must be just his imagination, right? A person summons sacred power, sends an image from their head to the spirits, and they manifest it. That's the very foundation, isn't it? Sito replied that imagination is certainly important, but that's not how spiritual powers are activated. Spiritual power turns into art when they attune themselves to it. The boy asked again, what? All the guys were stunned and listened attentively. Sito explained that there are 8 basic frequencies. The first is fire, the second lightning, the third healing, and ice. They should be familiar with these 4. Besides that, there's gravity control, light control, atmospheric tension, and what he demonstrated earlier, and that's spatial protection. And based on this foundation, he continued explaining the material when suddenly the old teacher was stunned and mentally wondered if he really meant to say he could use all the spiritual arts. Sito explained that he had transformed lightning into a spear and thrown it. This is where imagination comes into play. And now they were beginning the real lesson. He folded his hands in front of him, confident that all the guys were enjoying his lessons. After the lesson ended, he went outside and thought that in any case, he needed to continue his investigation in this huge academy. Students were wandering everywhere, and nothing seemed particularly suspicious. He should look where students didn't go. He noticed Lise Miria, who was actually nearby, and exchanged glances with her. She glanced at him too, and when he passed, she asked who he even was. He replied that he thought he was just a lowly being to her. Liesmiria admitted he was unusual. A lowly being wouldn't be able to use all the arts at once. As Sito said in class, anyone can do it if they learn to tune into the frequencies. She was surprised he said it as if it were easy. If they could all do that, he wouldn't be causing so many questions. After all the students were seriously discussing him now. She turned abruptly and asked him to go to a more secluded place with her. When they walked a little further, Maria asked if he would answer her question. Sito replied that he was simply an ancient man who slept in a Kodama village 100 million years ago. She replied that he was a joker, so should he answer her? What did he do 100 million years ago? Sito replied that it was many things, but he was an agent. Maria wondered what that meant. He replied that he was someone who worked to the point of exhaustion for his country. He defeated so many scumbags that he couldn't even count them. Even though it was 100 million years ago, for him it felt like yesterday. He remembered all the battles and felt a real nostalgia in his soul. Maria asked, so how could such a man sleep for 100 million years? He replied that he'd failed, that he believed in himself too much and thought he could handle everything alone. And because of that, he couldn't do anything and lost absolutely everything. He'd taken this job because he thought he might need help in the future. Maria wondered how much of this was actually true. Sito asked, by the way, where are they going? Maria decided she at least needed to show him something. When they entered the abandoned hut, she showed him a special room and said they were supposed to come here. Sito looked around in surprise and asked, what is that? She replied, it's a room for teacher supplies used in classes. Sito realized it was a utility room when suddenly he saw a wooden owl standing on a shelf. He examined it carefully, then turned to Maria and asked, why did they come here of all places? She was also investigating, and there was a strange empty space next to this room. She showed it on the map and said it was big enough to fit another room. Isn't that suspicious? Doesn't he think? If there's something hidden there, then. But before she could finish, Sito suddenly turned away the owl, which clicked and said he understood everything. He opened the doors to the tunnel in a way that surprised Maria and said that it seemed she was right. There was a staircase inside the room, and Maria asked how he knew. He replied that in such a dusty place, only one thing was strangely clean, and that was the owl. The rest was just a guess from experience. He decided to check something there and let her wait here. Maria screamed in fear. She would go too. Sito replied that there was a possibility that there could be a distorted one there, and that was dangerous. Maria asked him not to dare underestimate her. She had the best grades in the entire academy. She was no weaker than her brother. Sito answered okay. Then he trusted her. He smiled, and they both went inside. Sito created light in his hand and said that the stairs seemed to go quite deep. Maria realized that at such depths in the darkness, light control was very useful. Sito mentioned that in books, monsters appear in exactly these kinds of places, and she was surprised. In books? Regarding what he was talking about, if he fought crime so much, had he noticed anyone suspicious yet? Sito asked if she was expecting too much from the first day. Well, yes, Teacher Ludman could be involved. Maria asked again. What made him think that? Sito replied that when he spoke, he seemed calm, but when he was silent, it seemed as if his heart was uneasy, as if he was being forced to do something he himself did not want. He was also very cautious, and he pretended not to notice anything. Maria thought that Teacher Guita was the most suspicious. Sito said he couldn't handle something like that. He was too easily overcome by emotion, and there was no double dealing, and deep down, he was probably a good person. At that moment, Sito stopped and smiled. That's how it was, he said. They looked around, and before them lay a huge hall. Maria was surprised, never having imagined there was so much space under the academy. Sito replied, yes, but before he could finish, Maria asked him expectantly, what's there? He hadn't expected to find it here, and he was dumbfounded. This door led to one of the Kagura laboratories scattered throughout the world. As he stood in front of the door, he thought it was protected by machines, and there was no doubt about it. Maria asked, a huge door hidden under the academy? Could they get inside? Sito replied that usually an access key was needed, and Maria didn't understand what they should do. He replied that it was some kind of special key for this door, but it suddenly occurred to him that a Hakama in Kodama village had used such a key. This meant that someone here might also have it. In that case, he looked at his hand, then cast a magic spell and touched the door. The system spoke. Highest level genie access confirmed. The lock opens. When the door opened, Sito declared that whoever wanted to plunge this country into chaos must possess the access key. Inside the room was a huge monster in a cage. It was a creature of incredible size, and Maria was frightened and asked if there really was something like that beneath the academy. She clutched her mouth and began to moan in fear and terror. Maria also didn't understand how he'd opened the door. Didn't a key be needed for that? He replied that ancient people were special, and Maria wondered if he really meant to say he lived 100 million years ago. When Sito looked around, he said something seemed strange. Why were these animals sitting here so calmly? Not a single one of the corrupted ones was even trying to make a scene. If you recall, the corrupted one in the bandit's cage was already sitting quietly. More importantly, how did they manage to drag such huge corrupted ones here without anyone noticing? Smiria immediately began to say that it meant her brother was right to suspect the academy. If they just waited, the culprit would definitely show up. Sito replied no. First, they needed to close the academy and destroy the corrupted ones. Smiria started screaming. Did he want the culprit to find out and escape? Sito said he understood her feelings, but what would happen if the corrupted ones got out? The ordinary students above them would be the first to die. Smiria was stunned with horror and continued listening. Sito continued to say that her brother also believed that the safety of innocent people was more important than catching the villain. Smiria replied that he was right, and Sito added that he had a bad feeling about this, and it rarely let him down at times like this. He wanted to study this lab more closely. Could he trust her to find Largus and tell him to seal the academy? At that point, he turned around and said that in that case, he hoped there were some clues about what was really going on here. Sometime later, when the students gathered around teacher Greta, he became very angry when he heard a rumor that his new teacher had kicked his ass. How pathetic he was. Gita thought about how this damned inferior being had ruined his entire reputation. He could use all the spiritual arts? That couldn't be right. He would expose him himself, and they would all see it. With these words, he ran to get to work when suddenly the director approached him, addressed him by name, saying that he was frightening the students. Maybe he would behave more calmly. He was surprised by her appearance, and she said that it was not for them to judge his hobby, but that was unacceptable. Greta was surprised. Did she really call it a hobby? She continued talking. And by the way, had he seen Lord Ludman? Greta was surprised and said that since she mentioned him, it seemed he hadn't seen him since the entrance ceremony. She replied that this was a problem because she needed to discuss the students' lessons with him a little. The director clutched her head when she suddenly looked into the distance and saw dark lightning, frightening her. What was that? Meanwhile, Lise was quickly fleeing the dungeon and climbing upward. She tried to catch her breath from the horror she had experienced and realized she needed to quickly reach her brother. At that moment, someone asked her where she was rushing to. Lady Smiria. It turned out to be Ludman, standing directly in front of her, glaring ominously. She exclaimed, Ludman's teacher. Meanwhile, the protagonist observed the monster's actions and suddenly found a strange device with bright red lightning. He wondered why it was pulsating like something alive. Could it have been Kagura who created it? He approached the equipment and opened the drawer containing the cube and syringe. Could it really be the cube with the message and the nanomachine injector, like last time? He hoped that it was telling him something that would explain what was happening. Sito grabbed the cube. A projection of Kagura appeared, who waved at him and asked if he could hear him. He's here? Let him look here. But of course he can see him. This lab is closest to where he'll wake up. Anyway, in this lab, he was working on an amazing machine, and part of its function is sealed in nanomachines. He's a real genius, so that's it. Does he know what it does? It's a teleportation device. When Sito heard about it, he was terrified and asked again, teleportation? He looked closely at the monsters, then became frightened and asked, is this really true? After some time, the monsters continued to make strange sounds, and the clock hand approached 12. The device continued to make loud noises, and Sito mused that it was a teleportation device, a technology that connects one place to another, and 100 million years ago, they were never able to complete it. If this is true, then the distorted ones that appeared in the capital and the matter Argus spoke of were all made possible by teleportation, and the huge distorted ones in the cells are also here thanks to it. And here is this teleportation device. After which, he pointed to the object with his hand. Sito looked at it in shock and realized it looked completely different. Then what is that in front of him? When the hand struck exactly 12, everything in the object shone with a bright light, and Sito shielded his face from the rising wind. Suddenly, all the monsters became angry, and the cells emptied a moment later. At that moment, Rhea ran to Argus and shouted that they had an emergency in the capital. He confidently replied that he knew everything, that this was the worst possible scenario. Huge monsters began attacking them from the sky. At that moment, Ludman asked Lias if something was wrong. She looked somehow gloomy. What happened, Lady Wilton? Smiria got angry and told him to get out of the way. He was behind this, right? Ludman said, oh my god, so she already knew everything. Yes, she'd been sniffing around here for a while, but she was too late. And Smiria asked again, what are you talking about? Ludman replied that he wanted to say that today was the day they would make their move. They had originally planned to do it later, but their investigation had forced them to hurry. He looked into her eyes terrifyingly and realized that the man was a threat, and abruptly began to run. He knew at first glance that he would be no less troublesome than her dear brother. He had already discovered the secret passage. He was down there now, right? He wanted to get rid of his irritant. Smiria replied with a smile, right here, right now, and created a bright light in her hand. Ludman asked terrifyingly, do you really think you can defeat him? He had gained incredible power in his hands. At that moment, he started laughing loudly, when suddenly, some students approached them with a huge pot from behind, and Smiria was dumbfounded. Ludman shouted at her to let him show her this. It was his new power. A moment later, there was a loud crack and Smiria smiled. She was saved by Hakama, who hit Ludman on the head with a pot. He fell to the ground unconscious, and she declared it a victory. Lysmeria asked, "Where did they come from?" She replied that she was looking for Sito, because it was a real nightmare outside. They needed his help. And next to her was this girl, Kudo, who told her that she saw Sito somewhere around here. Lysmeria asked again, "Is she a new student?" Kudo bowed and shouted, "Yes, her name is Kudo Plutsa." "Is she sure everything is okay? Hitting a teacher and all that is pretty bad." Hakama replied that she was sure of it because he hadn't seen their faces. They would just blame it on this young lady. She pointed at Lysmeria, who was thinking, "What a cheeky country bumpkin." At that moment, the protagonist was climbing the steps, and Hakama turned around abruptly, realizing he was there. Sito asked, "What happened?" He immediately saw teacher Ludman fall, and Hakama reported that horror was happening outside, which Sito said he knew about. Every corrupted in the lab disappeared, and Lysmeria replied in a trembling voice that this meant they were all there. At that moment, the boys ran outside and saw a horrific sight. The entire city was ablaze with fire and smoke. Monsters were devouring people alive, and they were terrified, running in different directions to escape, screaming in pain and terror. The monsters continued to replenish and land right on the city, destroying everything around them. One of them began to roar loudly, and bright beams of light appeared from its mouth. Lysmeria exclaimed that they were already in the capital, and Sito realized his mistake. He needed to destroy this device immediately. Hakama called out his name and pointed, yelling for him to look. A huge monster, much taller than the average building in the capital, continued to roar loudly and emit flames from its mouth. It was aimed at the main castle, and Kudo said in a trembling voice that this enormous monster was attacking the royal castle. Lysmeria exclaimed that if it wasn't stopped, the royal family would perish. Sito said it was his mistake and he would fix it. He picked up the injection syringe, and the system informed him that with this enhancement, he would receive a simplified version of teleportation. He injected the syringe into his hand, and the system continued to say that with the energy for the machine, he could use it once a day, and that it only worked within line of sight. But at that moment, the monster struck the center of the castle with a bright beam of light. The protagonist vanished from the girl's sight, and Sito found himself directly in front of the beam, and the system informed him that he could choose the desired location himself. The protagonist extended his hand, using the protective barrier to save the kingdom. Meanwhile, people scattered in terror, trying to escape. A subordinate ran to the guildmaster and reported that a giant defiler had appeared on the outer wall. He replied that he knew everything about it, but there was nothing more they could do. It was Hardin Ganslot. Everyone who could fight was already there, and he was confident that all the holy knights were also capable of wielding a sword. The subordinate asked him what he meant. She replied that half of the holy knights were currently on missions outside the capital. The girl cried out in horror and fear. Meanwhile, the monsters had already destroyed half the city, and Hardin realized that this was a planned attack. His subjects by the time the knights left the city. If only the captain had been there, he could have stopped them. At that moment, the monster continued to attack the castle, and Hardin lowered his head, realizing that it looked like their end. The girl pointed her finger out the window and shouted, "Guildmaster, let him look at this." He opened his eyes and was stunned to see Sito defending the castle with his own hands. They realized this man was doing the impossible. He was from Kodomo village, after all. The girl exclaimed in surprise and blushed. She was incredibly happy, and hope appeared in her eyes. After a while, when the monster realized it had failed to attack the castle, Sito landed and swung his fist at the creature. A bright beam of light shot through the air with incredible speed and destroyed the enemy. One of the monster's heads was destroyed, and Sito realized that with such mass, it wouldn't be so easy to take it down completely. The teleportation had exhausted him even more than he expected. This time, things wouldn't go as usual. In that case, he might need to stretch a bit. He drew his sword, and swinging it once, struck the monster with incredible force, causing it to groan loudly in pain. Sito jumped away from the ground and realized that such wounds would heal in the blink of an eye, but it would be enough to distract. He needed to focus and utilize the basics of nanomachines. He rushed toward the monster, considering removing its body weight by controlling gravity and creating a wind current by controlling pressure. He could definitely do that. Leaping upward, he saw one of the monsters destroying a knight, who was screaming in horror. At that moment, the protagonist directed a fireball at the creature, causing it to melt. The guys shouted that they would cover him, and it turned out they were students from Harnisk Academy. The guy thanked them for their help and their courage. Another guy said that they couldn't sit idly by when the capital was in danger. They had no choice but to fight, and they found themselves surrounded by several monsters. At that moment, the protagonist came to the rescue, smashed the creatures with a few light swings, and moved on. The guys didn't understand what it was and who he was. Could it really be that guy from the lower classes? Sito wondered if the creature still needed time to regenerate, and he would close the distance first. The monster began to roar loudly with anger and tried to create two beams of light to hit the protagonist, but he was able to dodge these blows and realized that, aside from the attack, it wasn't that dangerous, and so he continued on his way, thinking that it was time to end this. Until it used that move again. He had to act faster and even faster. When he reached the monster, he leaped back with a sharp movement and struck it from the other side of the roof, causing it to become confused and unsure of what was happening. All the guildmates watched in amazement, frozen in horror. They were incredibly surprised by Sito's magical abilities, who continued to fight and destroyed the monster from multiple sides with a few moves, chopping it into pieces. When he managed to do so, he rose into the air, then turned the monster toward him and shouted that with this blow, he would finally finish the creature off. He directed all his power straight at the monster's head, and moments later, a bright flash of light erupted there. This lasted for a moment, and even the guild leader ran outside to watch closely. Hardin asked what was happening. Sito landed not far from the monster, and everyone realized that this man was amazing. But who was he anyway? 3 days ago, when the entire city was destroyed and ravaged, people took to the streets to help rebuild. Sito watched from the window and reflected on how, despite all the chaos, there were almost no serious casualties. The knights had done a truly excellent job. He sat up in bed and exhaled with relief, continuing to reflect on how, with many knights busy defending themselves and fearing that giant monster, they had quickly restored order after the massacre. The academy had also been reopened for investigation, and Lord Ludman, believed to be the ringleader, had been captured. He was in handcuffs, and the teacher and even the director suspected of involvement had also been detained. They were currently being interrogated at the royal castle, so the academy would be closed for now, even though he'd only been on the job for 1 day. Still, this mess had given him more work. He copes easily when all the enemies are in one place, but when they're scattered like this, he can't crush them all in one fell swoop. To protect everyone, he needs to become even stronger. He picked up the cube and, examining it carefully, realized he'd do anything for this. At that moment, someone knocked on his door, and he asked who it was. When he opened the door, he saw a beautiful girl in an incredibly beautiful dress, who bowed and announced that she had come for him. And Sito replied that he thought the academy was temporarily closed. Lismeria said that her brother had asked him to come by. He wanted to thank him for his help. He also said he wanted to discuss something else with him. Sito asked, did she come all this way just to call him? Lismeria confirmed that, of course she did. It would be extremely impolite to send a common servant for a man of his standing. Therefore, she, on behalf of the Wilton family, had come personally. Sito looked at her silently and then said, she's no longer calling him a lower being? Lismeria replied that she'd reconsidered her behavior and realized that you can't judge people by their appearance and that you should show respect to everyone, no matter who they are. So from now on, she'd like to remain under his control to heed his guidance and lessons. Hakama, who had been observing the scene, spoke up and she resumed her duties. At that moment, Sito saw her and called her by name. Hakama said the dorm was boring, so she came here to unwind. Lismeria turned around and muttered, what's she doing here, that country bumpkin? She said, some country girl dares to show up here uninvited, so why is she so shameless? Sito replied, she just said she realized everything, so what's the problem? Sometime later, at the Argus estate, Lismeria entered the room with Sito and Hakama, and all the servants lined up to greet them and say, welcome home, mistress. The lord asked the maid Poval and little Nino to escort the two, who replied that they were obeying orders. Sito remarked that it seemed they were already settling in. Nino said it was all thanks to the people here. And Sito asked, were they harmed during that incident? Poval replied, not at all. Everyone was protecting them. Sito realized he seemed to be taking good care of her. And at that moment, Poval mentioned that people were saying he, too, had accomplished something incredible. Lord Genie. Sito asked, who did they hear that from? She replied, it was from Lady Miria and Argus. Lismeria let it slip that, as his faithful disciple, she was simply obliged to sing his praises. He asked, what does disciple mean? Lismeria replied that since they shared the same blood as her teacher, they should follow his example in everything. The boys replied that they obeyed her, and Nino whispered that Lady Miria used to be very strict with them, but now she was very sweet. Sito replied that it was obvious. This was what he understood, the power of transformation. After some time, they approached the right door, and the maid apologized. Master Jin had arrived. She knocked on the door, and Argus, who was inside, allowed him in. When Sito entered, Hardy was also there, giving him a rude look. Sito silently looked around, and Argus thanked him for coming. Now he could sit down. They apologized for calling him so suddenly, and Sito said nothing. He was free anyway. Argus decided to first allow them to introduce their guest, the head of the capital's guild, Lord Hardin. Hardin rose from his seat and shook Sito's hand, saying it was an honor to meet him. His name was Hardin, and he hoped they would get along. And frankly, if he hadn't stopped that monster, this kingdom would surely have faced a national crisis. First of all, let him thank him for saving the kingdom, and Sito replied that he'd merely finished off that large creature. The holy knights of this country were dealing with the aftermath. If they wanted to thank someone, it would be better to thank them. Argus smiled, and Hardin realized he was a very modest man and not at all greedy. Or was there something else going on? Sito asked, is that all they wanted to say? Hardin replied, no, because of what had happened, the royal family wishes to meet him personally. He was dumbfounded and surprised. The royal family? But before he arranged that meeting, there was something he needed to clarify. Hardin asked, who exactly was he? Thanks to the guild members located in every city in this country, no such information would escape his notice. He took the liberty of inquiring about him but found absolutely nothing. Argus replied that he, too, wanted to clarify this point, but this time he wouldn't get an answer. Where did he come from? Lasmeria watched in fear, as did Hakama, and Argus asked again, what on earth was he doing in their kingdom? He was eagerly awaiting his answer. Sito scratched his head and replied that it wasn't that he was trying to hide it. He simply remained silent, because he didn't think anyone would believe him. If Argus had said so 100 times, then he would believe him. Sito smiled and replied that he would trust his words. He was a man who lived 100 million years ago. At that moment, Argus thought for a moment and realized that this would be the village of Kudama. He was the same man who had slept silently behind the gates. Hardin said it was hard to believe, but he believed him. At that moment, they turned to Lise, who reported that the teacher had opened an ancient gate beneath the academy that should never have been opened. Even if that weren't enough, they had all witnessed his power with their own eyes. Argus was dumbfounded and asked what had happened to her. Why had she suddenly changed so much? She looked stunning, and Sito said he'd slept for a very long time in the depths of this kingdom. He went to the capital to learn more about this era, and while Argus remained silent, Hardin asked what kind of information he was looking for. He replied that there were two things that interested him. The first was the Defiler. They existed 100 million years ago. At that moment, Argus and Hardin were stunned, and Sito blurted out that they shouldn't have lived to see the current era. Hardin asked again, why? He replied that it was the power of the spirits. Spirits were scattered across the world 100 million years ago. Then, a bright bolt of lightning flashed from a huge pipe and struck straight into the sky. These rays of light spread across the entire earth. Defilers can only survive in defiled places, while spirits possess the power to cleanse this filth. So why do they still exist in their time? Sito replied that he didn't know all the details, but according to his friend, the Defiler evolves. He pulled out the magic cube and Hardin realized, was this some ancient civilization's contraption? How did this whole thing even work? He had absolutely no idea. Could he really be from the era he was talking about? Sito replied that that was why he had come to this capital. He reasoned that the current era should contain the most information about how people fought the Defilers. Argus asked again, what about the second goal? He replied that it was a lead regarding a laboratory. One of them was located directly beneath the capital, built by a friend of his. He was searching for others, and his research labs scattered throughout the world. The protagonist considered it best to remain silent about the possibility of strengthening. Sito confidently replied that, whatever the case, he had only one goal: to wipe them from the face of the world. That was why he had come here. An awkward silence passed between them, and Hardin remarked that it sounded like a fairy tale. Argus replied that it was true, but he was willing to believe it. After all, they both wanted to put an end to the Defilers, and yet he shouldn't tell just anyone about it. People would think he was crazy. Sito smiled and replied that he knew about it, and Argus, turning to Hardin, asked, well? Hardin lowered his head and said that if he believed him, he would believe him. Besides, a plotting evil man wouldn't willingly rush into danger to protect the castle. At that moment, they didn't hear Poval enter the office and announce, Mr. Argus, she apologizes for disturbing you, but the time for his scheduled meeting is already up. He stood up and asked, already? Then the two of them can help him get ready, okay? Sito looked at Argus in surprise, not understanding what they were talking about. After a while, the carriage arrived right at the castle. Sito sat inside in his new clothes, musing that this would be a meeting with the royal family. That's how guests are greeted in this kingdom. But did he really have to change? Argus sat next to him and asked if he didn't like the outfit. It suited him very well. The girls were of the same opinion, right? Sito became embarrassed and replied that he simply felt uncomfortable moving. That's all. Hardin explained that the person he was about to meet, although only the acting king, was still the first prince of this kingdom. They should look the part and please treat him with understanding. Sito was dissatisfied that this was a silly hassle and hoped he wasn't getting involved in another adventure. A moment later, they found themselves in the kingdom, where knights stood in a row, awaiting a new guest. They entered the prince's room and knelt down, explaining that Hardin had brought the one who had saved this kingdom from destruction. The prince asked him to raise his head, and Sito looked at the king and realized that this was the second prince, Tails Kulmozia. Sito said it was a great honor to meet him. His name was Jin Sito. He replied that it was wonderful, and on behalf of his father, who was currently ill, he expressed his gratitude. He had done an excellent job, and Argus informed him that he hailed from Kodama village. Tails was surprised that someone like him could appear in such a remote place. Sito was angry that he had called his village that, and the prince, smiling, said that he would be honest with him. He wanted to have him completely as a holy knight of this kingdom. Let him swear allegiance to him and serve him. Sito was dumbfounded by the offer and became angry. The prince asked, so what's the matter? He couldn't hear his answer. Hardin, sitting up, said, Your Highness, they invited him here. He shouldn't speak in such a tone as if he were forcing him to do this. At that moment, Sito held out his hand and announced that they intentionally stayed in this kingdom for a long time. Tails heard that he was working at the academy. Is that true? Sito replied that it was only temporary, and the prince asked, does that mean he's refusing? He replied that he was afraid, and that was it. Tails said that in that case, nothing could be done. At that moment, the knights pointed their swords at them and surrounded them completely. The prince ordered them to take him into custody. Hardin began shouting, What is he doing, Your Highness? Tails replied that this man was, in fact, fact, suspected of treason. The defilers were hiding behind the ancient sealed doors beneath the academy, and they said this man was the one who discovered it. Isn't it natural to suspect him? Hardin, hearing this, was stunned with horror, and the prince said that perhaps even this salvation of the kingdom was just a performance he himself had staged. At that moment, Hardin became frightened and realized this was absurd. He was going too far. Sito refused to budge and remained silent. The prince remarked that, nevertheless, his power was too valuable. If he decided to serve him, he would probably be willing to turn a blind eye. He smiled and said that if he refused, there was nothing he could do. Right? Argus lowered his gaze and realized he'd only recently arrived in this city and couldn't possibly have been involved. He'd already told them he'd entrusted him with an investigation at the academy. So he'd been deceived, and he should have known better from the way the guards had been posted. The captain of the 3rd and 4th squads were fanatics blindly loyal to the first prince, and they would carry out any order, no matter how insane, just to please the prince. So he'd been planning to get rid of him the moment he'd refused, branding him a defiler. Tales blurted out that he was the very man who'd removed the great defiler. Leaving him free was too dangerous, but he was merciful and was giving him another chance. Let him swear allegiance to him, and then everything would be fine. Sito remained silent and, after a moment, replied that he didn't understand. The prince asked again, frowning. What? Sito asked. What's the point of a verbal oath in a situation like this? Even if he said it now, he could escape later, and then the oath wouldn't be worth a dime. Argus considered the possibility of some truth in this, and Sito continued to say that it seemed he simply wanted to hear him say it. That's why he was curious. Did he simply want to satisfy his lust for power over people, or was there something more to it? When the prince heard this, he became angry, and at that moment, the sword blade was right at the protagonist's throat. One of the guards shouted at him to watch his tongue. How dare he? Does he even realize who he's talking to right now? What an insolent fellow he is. At that moment, Sito grabbed the blade with his hands, and the guard realized his spear was shaking. At that moment, Sito picked it up and turned it over, right in front of him, saying, "Now." When the man hit the floor, he said, "Actually, he was talking about this." The prince was dumbfounded by what he saw, and Argus clutched his head. The female knight pulled her hand out and screamed, suddenly unable to use her spiritual techniques because they weren't working. She shouted for the others to grab him immediately. All the knights rushed to attack Sito, who easily destroyed one knight after another, avoiding their traps. Tails stood up and shouted, "What is he doing, Argus? Let him help them now. He dared to go against the royal family, so let him pay for it." Argus grew angry, and gritting his teeth, rose from his seat, then said, "Nothing personal," and raised his sword at Sito. The prince laughed loudly and shouted, "Fine. He doesn't care whether he's alive or dead, but he must grab him now." At that moment, Sito used his magical powers, and all the knights rushing towards him were frozen in terror. He was right that leaving someone like that unattended was too dangerous, and even if he had wanted to, this city would have been razed to the ground. But he didn't do it because he wants to be on the side of the people. His goal is to protect those who live here and now. However, there is an exception. He found himself right behind the prince, who was frightened and whispered to him that the scum whose shadow casts its shadow over people's lives should not be expected to show mercy. Was he one? When the protagonist asked the prince this question, he was terrified and didn't know what to do. His mouth dropped open in shock, and at that moment the knight screamed, "Does he even understand what he's doing?" Sito replied that he understood everything. He was simply fighting back against someone who was trying to do him injustice. The girl's face twisted in anger, and the guard screamed, "So, does that mean he's going to be at odds with the entire kingdom?" He replied that he wasn't the one who was going to be their enemy. If a person is from the royal family, he will show them due respect and abide by the laws of this kingdom, and will help them if their demands are reasonable. But he's not so cheap as to silently tolerate utter nonsense, and if they continue in this vein, he wants to know something first. Is he a common fool who thinks everything in this world should be as he wishes, or some other kind of fool? When Sito asked him this question, he looked him in the eye when suddenly a beautiful girl entered the office and announced that she had heard everything. If they don't mind, then let her join their conversation. When the lady entered, the knights bowed and said, "Lady Charlotte." Argus breathed a sigh of relief and realized she had arrived. He would leave everything to her, the second princess. She smiled and said that they were having fun here, dear brother. Tails was angered by her arrival and looked into Argus's eyes, who calmed down and understood. So that's what it was. Charlotte said he was putting her in an awkward position. Since he invited the hero to the kingdom, it was worth inviting her too. After all, right now he wasn't even qualified to replace their father. He grew angry and said that, unfortunately, the man in front of her wasn't a hero at all, but a criminal who dared to sneer at the royal family. Charlotte asked in surprise, "Is that so?" The knights began to confirm, "Yes, my lady. This insolent man attacked the captain of the 4th Division of the Holy Knights, Vass." She asked again. Perhaps they had misinterpreted his actions. Vass didn't understand. How could she say something like that? Just let her look at him. He was threatening the first prince of this kingdom right now. She replied that she saw him standing behind him. Tails was simply dumbfounded by this, and Charlotte asked again, "Isn't that right, Genie Saito?" He smiled and replied that it was exactly so and bowed to her. He had simply stood behind him and asked a question, and nothing more. Charlotte said that he had heard him, brother. He wasn't going to call him a criminal just because he stood behind him, was he? Tails became very angry and clenched his fists. Charlotte said that she would repeat herself. Genie Cedo. She wouldn't ask him to serve this kingdom, but if this kingdom were in trouble, would he agree to come to their aid as a friend? Saito smiled and replied that he would gladly do so. Charlotte thanked him for this, and in that case, continuing the conversation here wasn't the best idea. She clapped her hands and decided to change the scenery right now. She would show her new friend everything here, so they should give her way and observe the decorum. The knights exhaled in horror, and the prince became very angry with his sister. After a while, the guys rode home in a carriage, and Argus said that Cedo had really scared him back then. Why had he even pulled that stunt? He replied that he'd simply felt something strange there. He hoped it was just his imagination, and in any case, she'd been a great help. Charlotte sat in the carriage with them, and smiling, said there was no need for thanks. On the contrary, they should apologize for the way they treated the kingdom's hero. She bowed to him, and Cedo asked what she was saying. It wasn't like that. Charlotte asked permission to introduce herself properly. She was Charlotte, the second princess, and she hoped they would remain good friends. Genie. Saito answered, of course, and Argus asked, but why did the prince go so far? She said that the details of his plans were unknown, but her brother was very ambitious. Once he ascended the throne, he intended to wage war on other states to expand their lands. In such a future, he, Cedo, would become a hindrance, but he shouldn't worry, and she won't let him lay a finger on him again. By now, Hardy was probably already reporting today's events to his father. When father limits his actions, it will not be so easy for him to plot against Cedo. And Cedo began to think that this wasn't what was actually bothering him, and Charlotte said that, besides, she had no intention of giving up the crown to her brother. Will he trust her, Cedo-jin? She smiled, and Cedo said yes, and replied that he trusted her. Argus asked, by the way, where exactly they were going. Charlotte replied that he had saved this kingdom, so summoning such a man and not honoring him with even the slightest reward would be simply terrible, wouldn't it? Besides, she heard he was staying at an inn. Cedo confirmed this. They got out of the carriage, and Charlotte said, pointing out to the side, that this is why she had prepared something for him. The boys stared ahead, stunned, and Cedo asked, isn't that an entire palace? Charlotte said that this villa once belonged to a nobleman who had left the capital long ago. He could do with it as he wished. Smiling, they entered, and Cedo realized that this place looked quite luxurious. Was she sure he could accept such a luxurious gift? Charlotte replied that, of course, it used to belong to a count, but the estate had been empty for a long time. Cedo asked, but what if the count will return? Charlotte smiled, and he said that she should forget about it. It was nothing. Still, an entire house was too much. Argus said that this is how much they valued him. Come on, let him come inside. This was his home now. Cedo looked around and was very surprised. Charlotte was very glad that he liked the gift. But Cedo didn't smile, and said that everything was clear. Perhaps it was too spacious for one person. Even a bedroom of this size was too much. Argus smiled, and said that in that case, he'd send a signal for them to keep an eye on the villas. The two would probably be thrilled to be here, so he asked if he was sure everything would be all right. Argus replied that he was already deeply in his debt, but if he didn't mind, he'd like to ask him for a favor in return. Cedo asked what kind of favor that might be. Sometime later, in the 7th Division's private training ground, the knights were sparring and training. They fought with all their might to defeat each other, their swords clashing. A moment later, Karina defeated her opponent and held a sword to his face, causing him to yell that he surrendered. Ria clapped her hands and told her she'd gotten stronger. Karina replied that she still had a lot of growing to do, but reflected on how, during that incident, she'd only been able to handle smaller opponents. But he, Cedo, who the hell was he? She clutched her head in tension, unable to understand how a member of a lower race could do such a thing. At that moment, one of the knights shouted the captain and saw Princess Charlotte. They entered the field, and Argus told him to continue training at the same pace. Cedo looked around, and Karine realized it was this guy, which made her very angry. She wondered what he was doing there. At that moment, Princess Charlotte was called to a comfortable seat. She smiled and thanked him for it. Cedo asked Argus what he wanted from him specifically. He replied that he thought he had already figured it out. Did he really want him to train them? Argus replied that he certainly did. He had seen it all for himself. Prince Tails is completely incomprehensible, and when it comes to intrigue, Princess Charlotte is a rival for the throne, and you never know what he will decide to do or when. The only ones truly devoted to protecting Princess Charlotte are them, the warriors of the 7th Division. They don't know when that time will come, so he wants him to help them become stronger before it does. He looked at them silently, thinking, they have a good foundation. It's obvious they exhaust themselves with training every single day, and yet they lack any strength. He bowed and realized it brought back memories. 100 million years ago, he trained like crazy to become a first-class agent and serve his homeland. At that moment, Argus stopped and shouted, everyone, attention, assembly. To raise their level of training, they invited a special mentor, the heroes of their kingdom. He asked him to teach them what they currently lack, so let them listen carefully. Is everything clear? The boys shouted, yes, sir. Cedo reflected that training the diligent guys was a pleasure, but he'd have to work harder with the rest. He also noticed the guys with disgruntled expressions and said that first he wanted to test their endurance. For now, they just had to run laps around the perimeter of the training field. Kareen screamed out of anger. What? They do that all the time. They all could use some extra stamina. He didn't come here to force them to do such boring things. At that moment, Rhea shouted, "Kareen, that's rude." Argus was also surprised by her reaction and apologized, suggesting they bend the rules a bit. Kareen asked again, "Rules?" Sito took off his cloak and approached her. He asked if her weapon was a spear, right? She replied yes, after which he grabbed the spear and asked her to try to land at least one hit on him. There was no time limit. If she could tighten it at least once, she wouldn't have to run. Charlotte thought it was funny, and Sito said that she clearly didn't want to learn from someone weaker than her, right? Kareen smiled and asked if he could wield a spear too. He replied, "No problem." At that moment, he tossed it to the side, spun it a few times, and caught it with ease. Kareen was dumbfounded by what she saw and became angry. Sito said that there was no weapon he couldn't master. 100 million years ago, he was training with a spear in his room. And when his friend approached him, who asked if it was a spear this time, it was Kagura, who asked if he had any hobbies besides training. Sito replied that he watched shows about heroes as a child, and Kagura was actually talking about the present. He's the best agent this country has. Doesn't he think he should take a break sometimes? Sito replied, drinking his drink, that he didn't have time for that. He had too many missions to infiltrate behind enemy lines. He's sent on missions empty-handed, and in such cases, he has to make do with whatever comes to hand. Therefore, no matter what weapon he gets, he must master it and perfect it to improve his chances of survival, even if only by a small amount. Kagura looked at him in surprise, then exhaled and said that he promised to create something that would forever rid him of his lack of weapons. At that moment, the protagonist aimed at his rival, who was trying to attack him. He looked sharply into her eyes, and their spears clashed. The spear flew past Kareen, who looked stunned, and Sito declared him victorious. A total of 15 defeats in a row. She became enraged and shouted that she wanted to do it again. The battle continued, and their spears clashed again, after which Sito realized that she moved quickly and had good reflexes. She tried to strike him again, and Sito realized she had considerable strength, clearly growing heavier with each blow from her copy. So that's the power of an evolved human. But her spear still flew off, and she sank to her knees, and Sito said they'd end it there. She screamed that she wasn't finished yet, and Sito replied that it was pointless to continue like this. Her stamina was at 0, and the longer she continued like this, the weaker she became. She looked questioningly at his back. Her breathing was completely useless. She merely masked the weaknesses of her technique with her innate abilities, but they lacked any precision. This was probably because the current era would be built around spirit magic, while the warriors of his time had completely different skill requirements. Now they would start by strengthening her body. Would she not grumble anymore? Kareen was furious in her mind and realized he wasn't sweating at all. How was that even possible? He offered her his hand and asked if she could stand up. Kareen realized she'd have to admit defeat, because he was truly strong. Sito looked at her questioningly, and Kareen offered him her hand. He then said that in that case, they'd start with a jog. The boys looked at him in surprise and got to work. When night fell, Tails walked through his castle with a lantern and opened the cage where Ludman was being held. Ludman said a very important person had dropped in to see him. Tails replied that he wanted to have a quick word with him, the instigator of this unrest. He replied that he had nothing more to say, and he was surprised. And in this situation, he was quite confident. Was he really up to something again? Ludman replied that they would see, but only if he allowed him to say one thing. Even if they managed to save them this time, sooner or later the royal family would perish. Tails asked with a smile, "Is that so?" Then it all becomes clear. Maybe they should test the power of this pendant? Ludman, stunned, looked at the pendant, frightened, and started screaming. Where did he get this? Tails asked. Did he really think this was his exclusive privilege? These are weapons of invasion. It seems like this is an artifact that contains the power of the devourer, right? Most likely the current commotion was also caused by this weapon? Ludman screamed, but how? Tails asked him not to panic, and the curiosity was just beginning. He doesn't like the royal family, so wouldn't he like to join forces with him? Ludman was dumbfounded, and Tails said that his father and Charlotte were too soft, and if things were left as they were, sooner or later, the kingdom would be taken over by other countries, and that would be fine. Ludman blurted out that he, a member of the royal family, was planning to destroy his own dynasty. He replied that this was precisely the case. This kingdom needed to be rebuilt from the ground up to become strong and majestic, and to do this, he needed the power of their invasion weapons. Ludman replied, well, fine, only he could promise to take the throne in the new kingdom. Tails replied that he didn't care, but in return, he must swear allegiance to him. Ludman asked again, what? He confirmed. That's right, he wouldn't want him to think of betraying him. He asked, this fool, is there any point in swearing oaths? He was simply using him, and in the end, he would undoubtedly get rid of him. Well, fine, he hadn't intended to leave any of the royal family alive anyway, so he swears allegiance to him. Tails asked again, have you really decided to swear an oath? At that moment, a powerful magical force appeared around the pendant, and Ludman swore allegiance through magic. This artifact casts a powerful spell on anyone who speaks certain words, and even if it was a lie at the time, it will compel them to believe they spoke from the heart. He lowered his gaze silently and said, "His lord, let him command him. He will fulfill his every command." Tails replied that this was simply pathetic. The very thought of them, pathetic upstarts of filthy blood, hoping to take the place of the royal family, filled him with nausea. They were all just pawns serving his purposes. The one truly worthy of ruling this kingdom is not Charlotte, and certainly not Ludman. Only he is destined to lead this kingdom. After a while, Sito ran with his students and said that it was still pleasant. Okay, they'll call it a day. When he turned around, he saw that everyone had fallen down without strength, and realized they looked like characters from an old sports manga after a hellish workout. He scribbled under his breath and apologized for going a bit overboard. Argus said everything was fine. On the contrary, it was good that they'd immediately identified their weak stamina. They usually travel on horseback and rely on quick victories with spirit magic in battle, which is why stamina hadn't received the attention it deserved. So for the time being, they'd focus on strengthening their stamina. Sito replied that this was an excellent decision. By the way, Her Highness, shouldn't she be returning to the palace? She asked if she was really bothering him. He replied, not at all. But they really should be, otherwise they'd get into trouble for being late. Before that, Mr. Jin, she'd like to clarify something with him. He looked at her questioningly, and Charlotte pulled a special item from her pouch and asked if he'd seen anything like it. He remembered seeing it underground, and asked what it was. She replied that the Unitarians had seized it from Lord Ludman, one of the main conspirators. It's a dark artifact that harnesses the power of the Defilers, and they call it an invasion tool. When Sito realized this, Charlotte continued to say that they didn't know who created it. However, according to rumors, this gives the owner some special power. He was frightened and realized that similar things were already commonplace in this era. Wasn't this the mechanism, the mechanical device into which the fold part was implanted? Charlotte replied that judging by his reaction, he'd encountered something similar before, and Saito replied that he'd seen similar devices in the Academy's dungeons, and deeming them too dangerous, had taken the liberty of destroying them. Argus then said that this was the very device that started all this chaos. Charlotte replied that it was a wise decision, because if it had remained there, the enemies would certainly have taken it. She's going to find out the origin of this artifact, and if he learns anything, she asks him to let her know. Sito replied, okay, and with that, Charlotte rode back to the palace. Argus said, so this is a weapon of invasion. A repeat of this disaster must be avoided, and they must be on guard. Sito confirmed this when Argus suddenly asked, is something wrong? He watched Charlotte leave and muttered, no, nothing, and turn around, he said. By nature, they can't simply stop killing and freeze. Had they really been inactive and waiting for the command just because of this weapon's influence? No, it seemed to him they were waiting of their own free will, and their actions after being summoned were too coordinated, as if under a single command. Was it possible to achieve such discipline without direct control through the weapons? Sito was stunned and realized, discipline? Kagura had told him that new evolved species of defilers had emerged due to environmental changes. So they're saying a leader capable of leading them has emerged among them? That simply can't be true. 4 days later, at the academy, the director blurted out, who could have imagined she'd be kept in custody for a whole week? Argus thanked her for her assistance, and Sito said exactly that, but he immediately denied any involvement. And yet, there were certainly plenty of fools within the Academy's walls. Argus replied that it wasn't her fault, Madam Director. She shook her head and said no, she should have noticed. If it weren't for him, everything could have ended in irreparable disaster. Sito smiled and said she shouldn't worry about it. The director said she'd heard that he'd actually been temporarily hired to investigate, and that he had nothing to do with the Holy Knights. Saito replied that was true, and she never imagined they'd be saved by a temporary mercenary. Suddenly, she sat up and thanked Sito for protecting this country and its students. Saito smiled back, as did Argus, after which the director asked, by the way, he plans to continue teaching, right? He grimaced, then realized he needed the money for travel, so he was planning to work for a while. But they'd been generously paid for saving the academy, so there was no longer any need for work. Argus said that this wouldn't work, and whatever the reasons, he'd taken on this responsibility, so he should be kind enough to see it through. Abandoning students after the first lesson was simply irresponsible. She was right, Argus said. But the director didn't let him finish, saying she wasn't being mean and that they should follow her. She led them down the hallway, and Sito asked, by the way, what happened to Mr. Gita? Argus replied that he was still in custody. Gita was screaming for him to be released, saying he wasn't guilty of anything. He was constantly muttering something under his breath, trying to frame him before. Sito smiled silently, and Argus said he'd received too many complaints for suspicious behavior and didn't even know what to do with him. Sito replied that he was harmless, so they should just let him go. The principal told them to let him sit there a little longer until he cooled down. After all, he had tried to set him up. Okay, now they were here. She opened the doors and allowed Sito inside, and when he saw what was inside, he was dumbfounded. There were so many students waiting for him to appear, looking at him in amazement. When Sito asked what it was, the principal replied that they had all come for him. Rumors of the hero and Nino had already spread throughout the country. All the students looked at him admiringly and whispered among themselves. Lismiria got angry, and asked if they had only just realized how cool he was and started sucking up to him. How could they not be ashamed of themselves? Leon replied that she hadn't gone far from them, and at that moment, one of the students approached him and said she simply had to tell him something. That day, she skipped class and went for a walk around the city, and then a monster attacked her from behind. She was terrified and couldn't do anything. They were so outmatched that she thought it was the end. And then Sito saved her, so she thanked him profusely, tears in her eyes. Many students gathered around him, also thanking him. The director put a hand on his shoulder and said that he could see it himself. He probably had his own things to do, but at least he could teach them occasionally. Sito agreed and smiled. 100 million years ago, when Sito first encountered the Defilers, his friend Kagura said, yes, that's the official name, approved by the government. These creatures are born of the rot and vice of humanity. But isn't that true? These creatures can only exist in zones with critical levels of pollution. And that means humanity has nowhere left to hide. Sito lowered his gaze, and a girl approached him and said he didn't look like himself, a djinn. It was Sakuma, a member of the government's first special mobile unit. The guys standing nearby, namely Mizuzuki, confirmed that this was true. Kazama asked where his eternal confidence had gone. He replied that this time their enemy wasn't people, but unknown monsters. They couldn't be destroyed even by a missile strike. Did they even have a chance of winning? Sakuma came closer, grabbed his face, and said that he was their country's most powerful agent. Wasn't he? Why was he so upset? He should show his signature loyal smile. Besides, if they cleanse the planet, those creatures will die out on their own, right? Kagura confirmed that this was most likely the case. Right now, their scientific enterprise is working hard on a device to restore the environment. The only question is how long humanity can hold out until it's ready, and then everything will be simple. They will hold them off, just like they always did. Right? Sito smiled silently as he looked at them and replied that she was right. After some time, all the members of their squad were destroyed by these monsters, and he was left completely alone. He fell to his knees in horror, and Sakuma, lying in blood nearby, asked, Jin, is that him? He shouted her name, and she was surprised that he was alive, as expected of him. He shouted that he would bandage her wounds right now, and Sakuma asked him not to do that, because it was too late. It would be better for him to listen to her. She would not ask him to save the world from the Defilers. Let him simply not give up until his last breath. After these words, she died right in his arms. Sito picked up the radio and asked Kagura if he could hear him. He answered yes, and Sito said what kind of human experiment with nanotechnology was involved, and he agreed to take part in it. Kagura asked again, is he sure? If his body is rejected, then he will die. He replied that if he continued fighting like this, the outcome would be the same, so he would not give up. It was at that moment that he made this decision, and he dreamed it all, causing him to jump up in his bed. He clutched his head and realized it was just a dream, then looked at the second cube that appeared on his nightstand, and picking it up, realized that everything was fine, and he remembered everything. He looked at the photograph of his friends from the past and realized that he would definitely return to this world, free of Defilers. No matter how long it took, he vowed to do so. Sometime later, in the northeast, the kingdom of Kermansia, the province of Plutza, the fortress of Melmos, a knight came running and reported an urgent report. A state of emergency. The army of the Northern Kingdom was advancing on their borders. The Supreme Commander said that he need not continue talking about the most beautiful sights. He looked into the distance and saw many monsters beginning to attack his kingdom. They screamed loudly, and Glenn said it would be difficult to cope with such numbers. A subordinate asked what they would do. The commander-in-chief conjured a bright magical ball in his hand and threw it toward the monsters, causing everything around him to glow with a bright light. He realized it had absorbed his attack. He shouted at his subordinate to immediately send a messenger to the king with a report. He would detain them here. The young man replied that he understood, and Glenn wondered if these were Defilers, capable of dispelling spirit magic, and that they had never acted so complexly before. Among them was the main monster, and he wondered what was happening to these creatures. Meanwhile, in the library in the royal capital, all was quite calm. Sito, rising from his seat, realized that, as he had thought, there was almost no information about Defilers here. The chronicles say that these monsters appear out of nowhere in human settlements in ancient times, bringing only death, destruction, and corruption. And that's all. Is it known where they hide during normal times, or do they appear spontaneously? That can't happen in an era when the ecology has been completely restored. It seems he can only rely on information from Kagura, who studied the Guardians to the very end. He hoped he'd left at least some clues in one of the laboratories, but so far, all the old research centers were located near ancient settlements. So his next target, but before he could finish saying that, he heard a scream. Didn't she tell her not to come here? Sito turned around and didn't understand what was happening. Across from him, several girls were standing around a girl being bullied. One of the students was saying that her presence here was annoying everyone. Didn't she understand that? The girls sat at the table, ignoring them, shaking with fear and unsure what to say. Sito realized that this was the girl who had been with Hakama back then, named Kudo. She'd said she'd received official permission to visit, and her rival had screamed that she didn't care about her permission. Did she even realize she could infect them? It was her fault this infection was spreading through the city. Could she really be the source of the new disease? Kudo was very upset and didn't know what to say. Sito realized it was a difficult sight, so he turned to the students and asked if they were having fun here. Charlotte stood up for the girl, asking, "Communicating with classmates is certainly useful, but it's customary to remain quiet in the library, don't they?" The girl turned around and realized the princess was next to her and began to shout. But before she could finish, Charlotte asked, "Do you want her to repeat what she already said?" The library was supposed to be quiet. After that, she approached Kudo and asked if she was okay. She was glad that Charlotte had saved her and apologized, as she always protected her. Charlotte replied, "No need to apologize." Charlotte turned her attention to Sito and said hello, explaining that it was an unexpected meeting in such a place. He answered, "Yes, indeed," and then asked what brought her here. Charlotte replied that she often comes here to broaden her horizons, and that this library has many more books than the royal castle itself. "Is he looking for something, Master Genie?" He answered yes, he was choosing where to go next. Charlotte asked, "Have you decided yet?" He replied that he was thinking of heading northeast, and she repeated, "The lands of the Plutz, the fortress of Melmos?" Kudo clutched her chest and screamed sharply, "He better not go there." Charlotte turned to her in surprise, and Sito asked, "Why not?" She replied that it was because no matter how strong he was, Master Teacher, he was powerless against the disease. He was surprised that, of course, in an age when there were no normal medicines, any epidemic was mortally dangerous. And Charlotte said yes. After all, she hadn't met him yet. This was Kudo, the heiress to these very lands where he was going. She trembled with shame and fear, and Charlotte agreed that she was the daughter of a noble family, very close to the royal family. Then he asked again, "What kind of disease is this?" Charlotte said that she thought so, and it would be better if he saw it with his own eyes. Kudo started screaming, "Miss Charlotte," but she replied that for someone of Mr. Jin's caliber, it posed no threat. Will he follow her? Sometime later at Carmonzia Castle, Charlotte opened the doors and announced that they needed to go inside. When they arrived, Kudo announced that it was her younger sister, the third princess. She is very ill and already on the verge of death. Sito realized what it was when he saw her neck, and Charlotte said that the infection was rapidly being recognized, and the capital was already under attack. The death toll was approaching 1,000, and the number of victims was growing every day. Once infected, a terrible fever grips a person, and excruciating pain pierces the entire body. There is no cure, and the outcome is always the same: death. He is well acquainted with this disease. It is undoubtedly a mutation syndrome. Charlotte approached the girl, grabbed her hand with tears in her eyes, and Sito reflected on the disease, which causes cells to rapidly mutate, killing the organism, unable to withstand these changes. 100 million years ago, it claimed millions of lives worldwide. A subordinate turned to Charlotte and said that, no matter how powerful a gift she possessed, it was best not to get so close. She replied that she knew about it, and Sito asked again what kind of holy gift it was. She replied that people with holy power were immune to it. That's why order was now maintained by the commander-in-chief of the Order of the Holy Knights, with his green power. Holy power. He remembered, so that's why she thought he was safe. In his case, the particles in his body simply destroy any pathogens overnight. And why wasn't she infected, Kudo? She replied that she also possessed holy power, but perhaps she had brought the infection to the capital. Princess Paris lacks this power, and her illness was most likely her fault. Charlotte replied that this was nonsense, and not her fault. She had come to the capital to enroll long before the epidemic began, so she could stop blaming herself. They would definitely find a cure, so she shouldn't be afraid. An old man standing behind her said it was easy for her to say this, but even their healers were dying one after another. And after all, most of them lacked holy power. They were obliged to isolate the carriers of the infection, and Madame Paris. Charlotte was dumbfounded by this, and began shouting that once they created a vaccine, there would be no need for it. They were trying to develop a cure, but at this rate, the kingdom would die out sooner. Sito understood that it was all useless. This disease wasn't caused by viruses or bacteria. It was spread by microscopic defilers. Essentially, it was a parasitic infection, and no earthly medicine would help. However, at that moment, he created a magical lightning bolt right in the room, and the old man started screaming, "How dare he, and what is he planning?" Charlotte also turned to him in fear, and Sito asked everyone to please move away from here.